Polar bear devours. Pastor during baptism ceremony, May 30th, 2025. The morning of May 30th, 2025 dawned crystalline and deceptively calm over Coronation Gulf in Nunavut, Canada. The ice stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by the dark ribbon of open water where Kugluktuk Creek fed into the Gulf. Pastor Samuel Wright stood on the rocky shoreline at exactly 6:47 a.m., his breath forming small clouds in the -15-degree air as he surveyed what would become, in less than 6 hours, the site of the most horrifying polar bear attack ever recorded in the Canadian Arctic. Samuel Josiah Wright was 43 years old, a man whose weathered hands spoke of a childhood spent on Manitoba fishing boats before God's call led him north to minister to the scattered Inuit communities of the Central Arctic. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his sandy hair now shot through with premature grey from 8 years of Arctic ministry. His congregation knew him as a man who never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, which was precisely why he stood shivering in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing for the first ever outdoor baptism ceremony in Kugluktuk's modern history. Behind him, the small wooden church of St. Michael's Arctic Mission creaked in the wind, its white-painted walls stark against the tundra. The building had been constructed in 1987, a simple rectangular structure that could hold maybe 60 people if they squeezed together on the handmade wooden benches. This morning, those benches sat empty, waiting for the congregation to return from what Pastor Wright believed would be a transformative spiritual experience. He had no way of knowing that by sunset, emergency helicopters would be landing where he now stood, and that his own blood would be freezing into the rocks beneath his feet. The idea for the lakeside baptism had come to him 3 weeks earlier during a particularly moving Sunday service. Mary Kanguk, a 62-year-old widow whose husband had died in a hunting accident the previous winter, had approached him after the service with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She wanted to be baptized, she said, but not in the small metal tub they used inside the church. She wanted to follow Jesus into the living waters, the way she had seen in the movies her grandson brought from Yellowknife. She wanted to feel the power of God's creation surrounding her as she made her public declaration of faith. Pastor Wright had initially hesitated. The safety concerns were obvious. The Arctic Ocean remained brutally cold even in late May, and polar bears were increasingly common around Kugluktuk as climate change forced them to spend more time on land. But Mary's request had stirred something in his soul. He had grown tired of the safe, controlled environment of indoor worship. His congregation faced daily dangers that most Southern Christians could never imagine. Hunting accidents, extreme weather, equipment failures that could mean death. Why shouldn't their faith be equally bold and raw? Over the following weeks, he had carefully planned every detail of the ceremony. The location was chosen after extensive consultation with local elders and the RCMP detachment. Coronation Gulf offered a protected cove where the ice had broken up early, creating a stretch of open water deep enough for full immersion baptism, but close enough to shore for safety. The creek mouth provided relatively warmer water, still brutally cold, but survivable for the brief moments required for the ceremony. Elder Tommy Krillick, 74 years old and the most respected hunter in the community, had initially opposed the plan. Tommy had lived his entire life on these shores, had seen polar bears kill 2 of his cousins and maul countless others. Bears were different now, he warned the pastor. Climate change had made them desperate, unpredictable. They followed their noses to any sign of human activity, and a gathering of people by the water's edge would be like ringing a dinner bell across the tundra. But Pastor Wright had persisted, and Tommy had eventually agreed to serve as a lookout, positioning himself with his rifle on a rocky outcrop 50 yards from the ceremony site. Other precautions were taken as well. Constable Jennifer Morrison from the RCMP would be present, armed and trained in polar bear deterrence. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the community's only physician, would have her medical kit ready. 2 snowmobiles would be warmed and ready for immediate evacuation if needed. What none of them knew, as Pastor Wright stood in the pre-dawn darkness making his final preparations, was that a massive male polar bear, designated as Bear 23M by wildlife researchers, was already moving toward their location. The bear had been tracked intermittently by GPS collar for the past 2 years, and researchers had noted his unusual size, over 11 feet in length and weighing an estimated 1,400 pounds, making him one of the largest polar bears ever recorded in the region. Bear 23M had not eaten in 17 days. Climate change had disrupted his normal hunting patterns, forcing him to range farther inland in search of food. His sensitive nose had detected the human scents from nearly 3 miles away, carried on the shifting Arctic winds. But unlike the defensive, fear-driven attacks that characterized most polar bear encounters with humans, 23M was exhibiting predatory behavior. He was hunting them. At 7:15 a.m., as Pastor Wright returned to the church to prepare for the morning service that would precede the baptism, Bear 23M was already less than 2 miles away, following the creek bed with the methodical patience of an apex predator who had learned that humans, unlike seals, stayed in one place long enough to be stalked. The congregation began arriving at St. Michael's Arctic Mission at 9:30 a.m., bundled in their finest parkas and sealskin boots. Mary Kanguk arrived first, as she had every Sunday for the past 3 years since her husband's death. She wore her best dress, a traditional amautic made from caribou hide and decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken her 6 months to complete. At 62, she was not a large woman, standing barely 5 feet tall, but her presence commanded respect. She had raised 7 children in the unforgiving Arctic, had survived the residential school system that had tried to strip away her Inuktitut language and cultural identity, and had emerged with her faith stronger than ever. Behind Mary came the Tutu family, David and Sarah with their 3 children. David, 38, worked as a heavy equipment operator for the hamlet, maintaining the few roads and the small airport that connected Kugluktuk to the outside world. Sarah, 35, taught at the community school, one of only 2 fully certified teachers in the village. Their children, Michael, 16, Jennifer, 14, and little Bobby, 8, had grown up hearing stories of the outside world, but had never lived anywhere but the Arctic. To them, the planned baptism represented adventure on a scale they had never experienced. The Comotes arrived next, Peter, 45, and his wife Agnes, 41, with their teenage daughters Lisa and Nancy. Peter served as the hamlet's senior administrative officer, a position that required him to navigate between traditional Inuit governance and the bureaucratic requirements of the territorial government. Agnes worked at the health center as a community health representative, providing basic medical care and health education. The family had converted to Christianity only 2 years earlier, and today's ceremony would be their first outdoor religious experience. Elder Joseph Palliser shuffled in alone, as he had every Sunday since his wife died 5 years earlier. At 79, he was one of the few remaining speakers of the traditional Copper Inuit dialect, and his knowledge of local wildlife behavior was encyclopedic. He had initially planned to stay home today, worried about the polar bear danger, but Mary Kanguk had personally asked him to attend, and his respect for her was absolute. The last to arrive were the Morrison family, Constable Jennifer Morrison, 31, her husband Craig, 29, and their twin boys, Dylan and Devon, both 6 years old. Jennifer was originally from Nova Scotia, had joined the RCMP 8 years earlier with dreams of serving in remote communities. She had been posted to Kugluktuk for the past 3 years and had grown to love the tight-knit community, though she remained constantly aware of the unique dangers the Arctic presented. Her service weapon was cleaned and loaded in its holster, and she had already made 2 radio checks with the detachment to ensure communications would be clear during the ceremony. At exactly 10 a.m., Pastor Wright called the small congregation to order. 15 souls in total, fewer than he had hoped for, but he understood the fear that kept others away. Outside, the temperature had risen to -8 degrees Celsius, and the wind had calmed to barely 5 knots from the northwest. According to the weather station at Kugluktuk Airport, conditions were as perfect as could be expected for an Arctic baptism. Unknown to the worshippers settling into their wooden pews, Bear 23M had closed to within 1 mile of their location. The massive predator had found a depression in the tundra where he could observe the human settlement without being seen. His black nose, a marvel of evolutionary engineering capable of detecting scents across vast distances, was processing a wealth of information. He could smell the wood smoke from the church's heating system, the rubber and metal of the snowmobiles, the various human scents carried on the wind. But most importantly, he could smell something else. The excitement, the adrenaline, the subtle chemical signatures that indicated the humans were preparing for something unusual. Polar bears, contrary to popular belief, are not simple opportunistic scavengers. The largest males, particularly those that have learned to associate humans with food, can exhibit sophisticated hunting behaviors. Bear 23M had been attracted to human settlements twice before, once at Goa Haven and once at Talayoke, and both encounters had been violent. Wildlife officials had attempted to relocate him after the second incident, but GPS data showed he had returned to human-populated areas within 6 months. Dr. Robert Mackenzie, a polar bear researcher with the Canadian Wildlife Service, would later testify at the coroner's inquest that Bear 23M showed all the behavioral markers of a problem bear, an animal that had lost its natural fear of humans and had begun to view them as potential prey rather than a threat to be avoided. The fact that he had survived to reach such an enormous size suggested he was not only physically dominant, but also possessed above-average intelligence and problem-solving abilities. As the morning service commenced at St. Michael's Arctic Mission, Bear 23M began his final approach. Moving with the fluid grace that made polar bears such effective predators despite their massive size, he followed a route that would bring him to the ceremony site from the north, using the natural topography to remain hidden until the last possible moment. His massive paws, each measuring over a foot in diameter, left tracks in the soft tundra that would later be measured and photographed by investigators, providing crucial evidence for reconstructing the attack. Inside the church, Pastor Wright delivered a sermon about courage and faith that would prove tragically prophetic. He spoke of the Apostle Peter stepping out of the boat to walk on water, of the faith required to leave safety behind and trust in God's protection. The congregation listened intently, particularly Mary Kanguk, who sat in the front pew with her weathered hands folded in prayer. "Sometimes," Pastor Wright said, his voice echoing slightly in the small wooden building, "God calls us out of our comfort zones. Sometimes he asks us to step into the unknown, to trust him in places where our own strength isn't enough. Today, Mary is going to take that step of faith. She's going to follow Jesus into the waters of baptism, and she's going to do it in God's own sanctuary, the magnificent wilderness he created." Mary nodded, tears forming in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment for months, had prayed about it every night since making her request. The indoor baptism tank seemed too small, too contained for the magnitude of what she felt happening in her heart. She wanted to be baptized in the living waters, surrounded by the ice and sky and endless horizon that had shaped her people for thousands of years. At 11:30 a.m., the service concluded with a final prayer, and the congregation began preparing for the move to the ceremony site. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had been sitting quietly in the back pew, began organizing her medical supplies. At 47, She was originally from Toronto, had completed her residency in emergency medicine before accepting a position with the Territorial Health Authority. She had been working in Arctic communities for 6 years and had seen every type of cold weather injury imaginable. Her medical kit included hypothermia treatment supplies, emergency blankets, heating pads, and a portable oxygen unit. Tommy Krlik checked his rifle one more time. A well-maintained .300 Winchester Magnum loaded with 180-grain soft-point bullets specifically chosen for their stopping power against large predators. At 74, his eyesight wasn't what it once was, but his knowledge of polar bear behavior was unmatched. He had personally killed 3 bears in defense of human life over the past 5 decades, and each encounter had taught him something new about how to read the subtle signs that preceded an attack. "Pastor," Tommy said quietly, as the congregation prepared to leave the church, "maybe we should do one more radio check with the wildlife officers. Bears are moving around more this week. Ice conditions have been unusual." Pastor Wright nodded and handed his satellite radio to Constable Morrison. She made contact with the RCMP detachment in Kugluktuk and received confirmation that no polar bears had been reported in the immediate area for the past 72 hours. The nearest confirmed sighting was 40 miles to the east, near Tree River. What they didn't know was that Bear 23M had moved far beyond the range of the community's informal bear monitoring network. At exactly 11:45 a.m., the group began the quarter-mile walk from the church to the ceremony site. The procession was led by Tommy Krlik, his rifle carried at port arms, his experienced eyes scanning the terrain ahead for any signs of wildlife. Behind him walked Pastor Wright and Mary Kanguk, followed by the other families in a loose group. Constable Morrison brought up the rear, her hand resting on the bear spray attached to her duty belt. The temperature had continued to rise, reaching -5 degrees Celsius, and the wind remained light. Visibility was excellent, nearly 10 miles in all directions across the flat tundra. Under normal circumstances, these would have been ideal conditions for spotting approaching polar bears long before they became a threat. But Bear 23M was not behaving normally. The massive predator had positioned himself in a small depression approximately 200 yards northeast of the ceremony site. From his vantage point, he could observe the approaching humans without being seen. His behavior in these final minutes before the attack would later be analyzed by wildlife experts as a textbook example of sophisticated predatory planning. Rather than rushing forward in the typical polar bear charge, he waited, allowing the humans to settle into their ceremony positions, where their attention would be focused inward rather than on perimeter security. At 12 p.m. precisely, the congregation reached the rocky shore of Coronation Gulf. The sight that greeted them was breathtaking. Endless ice, stretching to the horizon, broken by the dark channel of open water where they would conduct the baptism. The sun, hanging low in the Arctic sky, cast long shadows across the ice and turned the water into a mirror that reflected the brilliant blue of the sky above. Mary Kanguk gasped at the beauty of it. This was her homeland, the landscape that had shaped her ancestors for countless generations, and she felt a profound sense of connection to both her heritage and her newfound faith. This baptism would be a bridge between the old ways and the new, a declaration that her Christian beliefs enhanced rather than replaced her cultural identity. Pastor Wright began organizing the ceremony. Tommy Krlik positioned himself on a rocky outcrop 30 yards to the north, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. Dr. Chen established a small medical station 20 yards behind the main group, her supplies laid out on a waterproof tarp. Constable Morrison took up position to the south, creating a triangular perimeter around the ceremony site. The other congregation members arranged themselves in a semicircle around the water's edge, with the Tutu and Komoot children standing at the front for the best view. Craig Morrison was designated as the photographer, capturing what everyone expected to be a historic moment for the small community. At 12:15 p.m., Pastor Wright began the baptismal service with a reading from Romans 6:4. We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. His voice carried clearly across the water, and Mary Kanguk felt her heart racing with anticipation. What none of the humans gathered at the water's edge realized was that Bear 23M was now less than 150 yards away and closing the distance with deadly patience. The bear's approach route had been carefully chosen to take advantage of every depression and snowdrift that could provide concealment. His massive size, which might have seemed unwieldy, was actually an advantage. The sheer bulk of muscle and fat that enabled him to survive Arctic conditions also gave him incredible speed when he chose to use it. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a polar bear behavioral specialist who would later analyze video footage and witness statements from the attack, would describe Bear 23M's approach as absolutely textbook predatory behavior, demonstrating a level of tactical planning that we rarely see documented in polar bear encounters with humans. This was not a defensive reaction or a chance encounter. This was a planned hunt. At 12:22 p.m., Pastor Wright and Mary Kanguk stepped into the shallows at the edge of the open water channel. The cold was immediate and shocking, but both had prepared for it mentally and physically. Mary wore a waterproof dry suit underneath her traditional dress, while Pastor Wright was dressed in a thick neoprene wetsuit covered by his baptismal robes. Even with these precautions, they would only be able to remain in the water for a few minutes before hypothermia became a serious concern. The congregation watched in reverent silence as Pastor Wright took Mary's hand and began wading deeper into the channel. The water, dark as black coffee and cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes, reached their waists as they moved toward the center of the open area. Ice floes drifted past them like ghostly sentinels, and the sound of water lapping against the rocky shore created a peaceful rhythm that seemed to enhance the spiritual significance of the moment. Mary Kanguk, Pastor Wright said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, do you confess Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and do you promise to follow him all the days of your life? I do, Mary replied, her voice strong despite the cold. I confess Jesus as my Lord. It was at that exact moment, 12:24 p.m., according to Craig Morrison's camera timestamp, that Tommy Krillick first spotted movement in his peripheral vision. Years of hunting experience had trained him to notice the slightest disruption in the natural patterns of the landscape, and something roughly 100 yards to the northeast had caught his attention. He turned his head slowly, not wanting to alarm the ceremony participants with any sudden movements, and felt his blood turn to ice. Bear 23M was no longer hiding. The massive polar bear had risen to his full height and was moving toward the ceremony site at a steady walk that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. Tommy estimated the bear's size instantly. This was not one of the smaller females or juveniles that occasionally wandered near the community. This was a fully mature male, probably over 1,200 pounds, and his posture indicated aggressive intent rather than curiosity. "Bear!" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking like a rifle shot across the peaceful ceremony site. "Polar bear! Northeast! Everyone to the snowmobiles now!" The effect of his warning was immediate and catastrophic. Mary Kanguk, startled by the sudden shout, lost her footing on the slippery rocks beneath the water and plunged completely beneath the surface. Pastor Wright lunged forward to grab her, but his own footing was precarious, and the shock of Tommy's warning combined with the need for immediate action caused him to stumble as well. On shore, the congregation erupted into controlled panic. Parents grabbed their children, Dr. Chen began throwing medical supplies back into her bag, and Constable Morrison drew her service weapon while simultaneously reaching for her radio to call for emergency backup. The two snowmobiles, which had been kept running for exactly this type of emergency, were suddenly the most important objects in the world. But Bear 23M had been waiting for exactly this moment of confusion and vulnerability. The instant the humans began their panicked retreat, the bear broke into a charge that demonstrated why polar bears are considered one of the most dangerous predators on Earth. Despite weighing nearly 3/4 of a ton, he accelerated to over 30 miles per hour in mere seconds, his massive paws finding purchase on terrain where humans struggled to maintain their footing. Tommy Krillick, his hands shaking from adrenaline but his training taking over, shouldered his rifle and tried to acquire a clear shot. The problem was that Pastor Wright and Mary were still in the water directly between him and the approaching bear, and the angle made a clean shot impossible without risking the lives of the people he was trying to protect. In the water, Pastor Wright had managed to get Mary back to the surface, but both were now in mortal danger from hypothermia as well as the approaching predator. The shock of complete submersion in near-freezing water had triggered Mary's mammalian diving response, causing her heart rate to drop and her breathing to become erratic. Pastor Wright, still trying to maintain his role as protector and spiritual leader, was attempting to drag her toward shore, while his own strength was being sapped by the brutal cold. The bear covered the final 50 yards to the water's edge in less than 10 seconds. Constable Morrison, positioned to the south of the ceremony site, finally had a clear line of sight and fired 2 shots from her Glock 22 service pistol. The .40 caliber rounds struck the bear in the shoulder and flank, but rather than deterring the animal, they seemed only to enrage him further. Polar bear hide and blubber can absorb tremendous punishment, and unless a shot hits the brain or spine directly, even large caliber bullets may not immediately stop a charging bear. Tommy Krillick, now with a clearer shot as the bear reached the water's edge, fired his .300 Winchester Magnum. The rifle bullet struck Bear 23M in the chest, penetrating several inches into his massive frame, but the bear's momentum carried him forward into the water where Pastor Wright and Mary Kanguk were struggling toward shore. What happened next would be burned into the memories of every witness for the rest of their lives. Bear 23M, wounded but far from incapacitated, plunged into the channel with a splash that sent water spraying 20 feet in all directions. His massive head, nearly 3 feet from nose to ears, zeroed in on the 2 humans thrashing in the water with the precision of a guided missile. Pastor Wright, realizing that their only hope lay in reaching the shore before the bear could close the distance, made a decision that would define the final moments of his life. Instead of continuing to try to save both himself and Mary, he pushed her toward the shore with all his remaining strength and turned to face the approaching predator. "Go!" he shouted to Mary, his voice hoarse from the cold but still commanding. "Get to shore! Get to safety!" Mary Kanguk, her traditional dress now waterlogged and dragging her down, summoned strength she didn't know she possessed and began swimming toward the rocky shore where members of the congregation were reaching out to pull her from the water. Behind her, Pastor Wright spread his arms wide and began shouting at the bear, trying to make himself as large and threatening as possible. It was a gesture of incredible courage and self-sacrifice, but it proved futile against a predator of Bear 23M's size and determination. The bear reached Pastor Wright in seconds, and what followed was a demonstration of the raw power that had made polar bears the apex predators of the Arctic for millions of years. The bear's initial attack was swift and devastating. His massive jaws, capable of crushing a walrus skull, clamped down on Pastor Wright's torso with a force that could be heard as a sickening crunch, even over the chaos of screaming voices and splashing water. The pastor's baptismal robes, heavy with water, provided no protection whatsoever against teeth that measured over 2 inches in length. Tommy Krlik fired again, this time aiming for the bear's head, but the movement of both predator and prey in the water made precision shooting nearly impossible. The bullet struck the bear in the neck, causing him to release Pastor Wright momentarily, but the damage to the human was already catastrophic. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, watching from the shore as Mary Kanguk was pulled from the water by David and Peter Kamert, realized immediately that Pastor Wright's injuries were unsurvivable. The bear's initial bite had crushed several ribs and punctured both lungs, and massive hemorrhaging was already turning the water around them dark red. But Bear 23M was not finished. Polar bears, unlike most predators, will often continue attacking even after their prey is incapacitated, driven by instincts evolved over millennia of hunting in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The bear began what wildlife experts call a killing shake, violent thrashing motions designed to break the prey's neck and ensure death. Pastor Wright, incredibly, remained conscious through this initial assault. Witnesses later reported hearing him continue to pray aloud even as the bear mauled him, his voice growing weaker but never stopping. His final words, according to Mary Kanguk, who was closest to the water, were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Constable Morrison, having exhausted her pistol ammunition, drew her backup weapon, a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs specifically for bear defense. From a distance of approximately 15 yards, she fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The heavy slugs, each weighing over an ounce, struck the bear with tremendous force, finally convincing him to release his grip on the pastor. But the damage was done. Pastor Samuel Wright, beloved minister and devoted servant of God, slipped beneath the dark waters of Coronation Gulf at 12:31 p.m. on May 30th, 2025, exactly 7 minutes after the attack began. His body would not be recovered for another 43 minutes, and by then the Arctic waters would have claimed whatever life might have remained in him. Bear 23M, now wounded by multiple gunshot wounds, but still very much alive and extremely dangerous, hauled himself out of the water on the opposite shore of the channel. Tommy Krlik, his hands shaking from adrenaline and grief, continued firing until his rifle was empty. Several more shots struck the bear, but his massive size and the layer of fat that protected his vital organs allowed him to absorb punishment that would have killed smaller animals instantly. The bear finally collapsed approximately 50 yards from the water's edge, but even then, he continued to move, his massive head lifting periodically as he scanned for threats. Dr. Chen, whose medical training included extensive trauma surgery experience, later estimated that the bear had been struck by at least 8 bullets from various weapons, but his incredible physiology had kept him alive far longer than should have been possible. On the human side of the channel, the scene was one of controlled chaos as the survivors struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Mary Kanguk, pulled from the water just moments before the bear's attack reached its climax, was in severe shock and early-stage hypothermia. Her core body temperature had dropped to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and she was displaying symptoms of confusion and disorientation that indicated her condition was life-threatening. Dr. Chen immediately began emergency warming procedures, stripping Mary out of her wet clothing and wrapping her in emergency blankets and chemical heating pads. The congregation, meanwhile, was dealing with their own psychological trauma. Several of the children were crying hysterically, and Elder Joseph Palliser had suffered what appeared to be a mild heart attack brought on by the stress and shock of witnessing the attack. Constable Morrison, her training taking over despite her own emotional response to the horror she had just witnessed, was coordinating multiple radio calls. Her first priority was requesting immediate helicopter evacuation for the medical emergencies, followed by calls for additional RCMP units and wildlife officers to deal with the wounded bear and secure the scene. At 12:35 p.m., just 4 minutes after Pastor Wright's death, the first emergency response helicopter lifted off from Kugluktuk Airport. The flight crew consisted of pilot Captain Sarah Nunez, co-pilot Lieutenant Mike Charters, and paramedic specialist Janet McKenzie. All three were experienced in Arctic rescue operations, but none had ever responded to a polar bear attack with casualties this severe. The helicopter, a military surplus CH-146 Griffon operated by the Canadian Coast Guard, would take approximately 12 minutes to reach the scene. During those 12 minutes, Dr. Chen worked frantically to stabilize her patients while the other survivors struggled to maintain their composure and assist however they could. Tommy Krelick, his rifle now empty and the immediate threat neutralized, was experiencing a delayed shock response that left him barely able to stand. At 74 years old, he had lived through countless dangerous encounters with Arctic wildlife, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a polar bear literally tearing apart a man he had known and respected for 8 years. The bear, meanwhile, was slowly dying 50 yards away, his massive frame occasionally shuddering as his body fought to survive the massive trauma inflicted by multiple gunshot wounds. Wildlife Officer Patricia Lightning, who would arrive on scene 30 minutes later, would later note that Bear 23M's tenacity and refusal to die immediately after being shot was unusual even for polar bears, which are known for their incredible toughness. At 12:47 p.m., the rescue helicopter appeared over the ceremony site, its rotor wash scattering ice crystals and creating a localized blizzard that forced the survivors to shield their eyes and hold onto their gear. Captain Nunez expertly maneuvered the aircraft to a landing on relatively flat ground, approximately 100 yards from the water's edge, close enough for rapid patient evacuation, but far enough away to avoid contaminating the crime scene. Paramedic Janet McKenzie hit the ground running, her medical bag in one hand and a portable stretcher in the other. Her first priority was Mary Kanguk, whose hypothermia had progressed to the point where her speech was slurred and her coordination severely impaired. Working with Dr. Chen, Mackenzie established an IV line and began warming Mary with heated saline solution while preparing her for immediate transport to the hospital in Yellowknife. Elder Joseph Palliser was the second evacuation priority. His suspected heart attack required immediate cardiac monitoring and medication that was beyond the scope of field treatment. Within minutes, both patients were loaded into the helicopter and airborne, beginning a 400-mile flight to Stanton Territorial Hospital that would take just over 2 hours. Left behind at the scene were the remaining survivors, a second helicopter crew that had arrived to assist with the investigation, and the massive, slowly dying form of Bear 23M. The bear had finally stopped moving, but wildlife protocols required that he be confirmed dead before anyone could approach the body or attempt to recover Pastor Wright's remains from the water. Wildlife Officer Patricia Lightning, a 28-year-old Inuit woman with a degree in wildlife biology from the University of Alberta, had the grim responsibility of confirming the bear's death and beginning the investigation into what had gone wrong. Her preliminary examination of the scene revealed several disturbing factors that suggested this attack was unlike typical polar bear encounters. First, the bear's approach route indicated sophisticated stalking behavior rather than the opportunistic aggression that characterized most human-bear conflicts. The tracks in the tundra showed that Bear 23M had deliberately positioned himself downwind of the ceremony site and had waited for optimal conditions before beginning his attack. Second, the bear's physical condition was remarkable. Despite being wounded by multiple gunshots, he had continued fighting far longer than normal, suggesting either unusual physiological resilience or a level of desperation that indicated severe malnutrition. Field measurements would later confirm that Bear 23M weighed approximately 1,420 pounds and measured 11 feet 2 inches from nose to tail, making him one of the largest polar bears ever recorded in the region. Most troubling of all was the discovery of a GPS collar around the bear's neck. The device, manufactured by Telemetry Solutions, had been attached to the bear 18 months earlier as part of a climate change research project. The collar's memory contained detailed tracking data that would provide investigators with a complete record of the bear's movements leading up to the attack. Dr. Robert Mackenzie, the wildlife researcher who had originally collared Bear 23M, received notification of the attack at 1:15 p.m. while attending a conference in Ottawa. His immediate reaction was one of professional devastation. The research project's goal had been to better understand how climate change was affecting polar bear behavior, not to track animals that would eventually kill humans. The GPS data would later reveal that Bear 23M had been exhibiting increasingly unusual behavior over the past 6 months. Instead of following traditional hunting patterns on the sea ice, he had spent growing amounts of time near human settlements, apparently drawn by scents and activities that were entirely foreign to normal polar bear experience. Climate researchers would eventually theorize that Bear 23M had become what they termed a climate refugee, an animal whose traditional food sources and habitat had been so disrupted by environmental change that he had been forced to adopt entirely new survival strategies. Unfortunately, those new strategies had ultimately led him into fatal conflict with humans. At 1:30 p.m., nearly an hour after Pastor Wright's death, dive teams from the RCMP finally deemed it safe to enter the water and begin the search for his body. The water temperature, hovering just above freezing, meant that decomposition would be minimal, but the strong currents in the channel posed significant challenges for the recovery operation. Constable James Hewitt, a certified police diver with 15 years of experience, entered the water wearing a full dry suit and thermal protection gear. The visibility underwater was poor, less than 3 feet in most areas, and the current was strong enough to require safety lines attached to shore-based anchors. It took 43 minutes to locate Pastor Wright's body. He was found on the bottom of the channel, approximately 30 feet from where he had initially been attacked, his baptismal robes tangled around a submerged rock formation. The damage inflicted by Bear 23M was immediately apparent even through the murky water. Massive trauma to the torso and head that left no doubt about the cause of death. The recovery operation was complicated by the need to preserve evidence for the coroner's investigation. Every aspect of the body's position and condition had to be photographed and documented before removal. Dr. Sandra Morrison, the territorial coroner, would later describe the injuries as consistent with attack by a large predator, specifically a polar bear of exceptional size and strength. Pastor Wright's body was finally brought to shore at 2:43 p.m., more than 2 hours after the attack began. The sight of their beloved minister, broken and lifeless, was the final trauma that broke the emotional composure of several survivors. David Tutu, who had known Pastor Wright since the minister's arrival in Kugluktuk 8 years earlier, was overcome with grief and had to be sedated by the medical team. The investigation into the attack would continue for weeks, involving wildlife biologists, RCMP investigators, territorial coroners, and federal agencies responsible for polar bear management. The final report, released 6 months later, would conclude that the attack was the result of multiple factors, including climate change, the bear's unusual size and behavior patterns, and the inherent risks of conducting outdoor activities in polar bear habitat. But for the survivors gathered around Pastor Wright's body on that terrible afternoon, the technical explanations mattered little. They had witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives: the brutal death of a good man who had been trying to serve his God and his community in the most hostile environment on earth. Mary Kanguk, recovering in the hospital in Yellowknife, would later say that Pastor Wright's sacrifice had not been in vain. His death had saved her life, she was certain of it. The bear would have killed them both if the pastor had not chosen to face the predator alone, giving her the precious seconds she needed to reach safety. But the cost of that salvation was almost too high to bear. The small community of Kugluktuk had lost not just a minister, but a friend, a counselor, and a man who had dedicated his life to serving others in one of the world's most challenging environments. His death would leave a void that would take years to fill, and would serve as a permanent reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and the unforgiving power of nature. The investigation into the attack would reveal disturbing trends about polar bear behavior in a changing Arctic climate. Trends that suggested similar tragedies might become more common in the years ahead. Climate change was not just melting ice and raising sea levels, it was fundamentally altering the behavior of one of the world's most dangerous predators, bringing them into increasing conflict with human populations that had no effective defenses against such massive and determined killers. Bear 23M died at the ceremony site at approximately 3:15 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the attack began. His autopsy would reveal 8 bullet wounds, massive internal hemorrhaging, and evidence of severe malnutrition that had likely contributed to his desperate and aggressive behavior. The bear had been slowly starving to death, and his attack on the baptism ceremony had been an act of desperation by an apex predator that had run out of traditional food sources. The tragedy at Coronation Gulf would ultimately lead to significant changes in how Arctic communities approached outdoor activities and polar bear safety. New protocols would be established, better warning systems would be implemented, and research into climate-driven changes in bear behavior would receive increased funding and attention. But for the people who lived through that terrible day, no amount of policy changes or safety improvements could erase the memory of watching a polar bear tear apart their beloved pastor in the waters where he had planned to celebrate new life and spiritual renewal. The baptism that was meant to be a joyous celebration of faith had become a nightmare that would define their community for generations to come. The Arctic had claimed another victim, and in doing so had reminded everyone who witnessed it that in the far north, nature remained the ultimate authority, indifferent to human hopes, dreams, and spiritual aspirations. In a land where temperatures could kill within minutes and predators roamed with impunity, even the most carefully planned activities could become death sentences with little warning. Pastor Samuel Wright had come to the Arctic to serve his God and his community, and in the end, he had given his life for both. His sacrifice had saved Mary Kanguk, but it had also demonstrated the terrible price that could be demanded from those who chose to live and work at the very edges of human survival. At Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife, 400 miles south of the attack site, Dr. Michael Harrison was scrubbing in for what would become the most challenging hypothermia case of his career. Mary Kanguk had arrived by helicopter at 3:52 p.m. with a core body temperature of 88.3 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously close to the threshold where cardiac arrest became almost inevitable. Her pulse was barely detectable, and her breathing had slowed to just 6 breaths per minute. Dr. Harrison, 46 years old and originally from Edmonton, had been working in northern medicine for 12 years. He had treated hundreds of cases of cold-related injuries, from frostbite to severe hypothermia. But Mary's case was complicated by the psychological trauma she had endured. Even as her body temperature slowly rose under carefully controlled rewarming procedures, she remained in a state of profound shock, mumbling incoherently about bears and blood in the water. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, establishing multiple IV lines for heated saline infusion, placing her on a cardiac monitor to watch for the dangerous arrhythmias that could occur during rewarming, and utilizing a specialized heated air blanket system that gradually raised her skin temperature without causing the peripheral vasodilation that could prove fatal. Dr. Patricia Morin, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, was called in to evaluate Mary's psychological condition. Dr. Morin, 51 years old and a specialist in trauma psychology, immediately recognized the signs of acute stress disorder that would likely develop into full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder if not treated aggressively from the beginning. She's experiencing what we call peritraumatic dissociation, Dr. Morin explained to the medical team. Her mind has essentially disconnected from the reality of what she experienced as a protective mechanism. The hypothermia has actually helped in some ways. It's slowed down her metabolic processes and may have prevented some of the neurochemical changes we see in severe trauma cases. Elder Joseph Palliser was in the cardiac intensive care unit 3 floors above, where Dr. Susan Mitchell was monitoring his condition following what had indeed been a mild myocardial infarction triggered by the extreme stress of witnessing the attack. At 79, Joseph's heart was already weakened by decades of Arctic living and a lifetime of subsistence hunting activities. The shock of seeing Pastor Wright killed had pushed his cardiovascular system beyond its ability to cope. "Mr. Palliser," Dr. Mitchell said gently as the elderly man drifted in and out of consciousness, "you've had a heart attack. We're treating you with medications to dissolve any clots and to protect your heart muscle. You're going to be here for several days while we monitor your condition." Joseph's weathered face turned toward her, his eyes filled with a sadness that went far beyond his physical condition. "Pastor Wright," he whispered. "Did they find Pastor Wright?" Dr. Mitchell nodded solemnly. "Yes, they found him. I'm so sorry for your loss." The old man closed his eyes and tears began flowing down his cheeks. He had lived through the residential school era, through the massive social changes that had transformed Inuit culture, through decades of hardship and loss that would have broken lesser men. But watching a polar bear tear apart the gentle minister who had become such an important part of their community had shattered something inside him that might never heal. In Kugluktuk, news of the attack was spreading through the community with the speed that only small, tight-knit populations can achieve. By 4 p.m., less than 4 hours after the attack, virtually everyone in the hamlet of 1,400 people had heard some version of what had happened at the baptism ceremony. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts remained consistent. Pastor Wright was dead, killed by a polar bear while trying to save Mary Kanguk's life. Harold Okina, the hamlet's mayor, was dealing with his own crisis of leadership. How do you respond to something like this? How do you comfort a community that has just lost one of its most beloved members in such a horrific way? Harold had been mayor for 6 years, had dealt with hunting accidents and equipment failures and all the normal tragedies of Arctic life, but nothing had prepared him for this. The first media inquiry came at 4:23 p.m. Rebecca Morrison, a reporter with CBC North based in Yellowknife, had picked up the emergency radio chatter and was trying to confirm details of what was being described as a fatal polar bear attack during a religious ceremony. Harold found himself thrust into the role of spokesman for a tragedy he was still struggling to comprehend himself. "Yes, we can confirm that there was a polar bear attack this afternoon during a baptism ceremony," Harold said carefully, reading from notes he had hastily scribbled while talking to Constable Morrison. One person was killed and several others were injured. The RCMP and wildlife officials are investigating the incident. Within an hour, Harold's phone was ringing constantly. News outlets from across Canada and around the world were picking up the story, and the unique circumstances, a polar bear attack during a Christian baptism in the Arctic, made it irresistible to media organizations hungry for dramatic content. By 6 p.m., the story was trending on social media platforms worldwide. Polar bear attack and Arctic baptism were generating thousands of posts, many of them from people who had never been north of Toronto but felt qualified to comment on Arctic safety protocols and wildlife management policies. Sarah Morrison, a freelance journalist based in Iqaluit, was one of the first to arrive in Kugluktuk. She had chartered a small plane and arrived at 7:30 p.m., just as the community was gathering for an impromptu memorial service at St. Michael's Arctic Mission. Sarah had covered northern issues for 15 years and understood the complex cultural dynamics that outsiders often missed. The memorial service was devastating in its simplicity. The same wooden pews where Pastor Wright had delivered his final sermon just hours earlier were now filled with grieving parishioners, struggling to make sense of what had happened. Tommy Krillick, still shaking from the aftermath of the attack, stood at the front of the church and tried to explain what he had witnessed. "Pastor Wright was a good man," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "He knew the risks." We all knew the risks. But he wanted to serve God and serve our community, and he died trying to save Mary's life. That's the kind of man he was. Agnes Comwat, who had been standing just 20 feet from the water's edge when the attack occurred, was struggling with survivor's guilt that would plague her for months to come. She kept replaying the scene in her mind, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some way she could have prevented the tragedy. "I keep thinking, what if I had seen the bear first?" she confided to Dr. Patricia Morin during a telephone counseling session that evening. Tommy spotted it, but what if I had been watching that direction? What if I had shouted sooner? Would it have made a difference? Dr. Morin, working with limited resources to provide psychological support to the survivors via telephone and video calls, was already seeing the classic signs of trauma response that would affect the entire community for years to come. The attack hadn't just killed Pastor Wright. It had shattered the sense of security and predictability that people needed to function in an already challenging environment. The investigation into the attack was being led by Sergeant Dale McKinnon of the RCMP, a 38-year-old officer with extensive experience in wildlife-related incidents. Sergeant McKinnon had arrived from Yellowknife on the same helicopter that brought the media attention, and he was methodically documenting every aspect of the scene while the evidence was still fresh. The GPS data from Bear 23M's collar was particularly revealing. Dr. Robert Mackenzie, the wildlife researcher, had transmitted the tracking information within hours of the attack, and the data painted a disturbing picture of the bear's behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident. This bear had been exhibiting increasingly unusual movement patterns for the past 3 months, Dr. Mackenzie explained during a conference call with the investigation team. Instead of following the ice edge for hunting, he had been spending more and more time inland, apparently investigating human scent trails and activity sites. This wasn't random wandering, it was systematic exploration of human territories. The tracking data showed that Bear 23M had actually approached the Kugluktuk area twice before, on April 15th and May 8th, but had retreated without making contact with humans. On May 30th, however, something had been different. The bear had approached the ceremony site and remained in position for over an hour before beginning his final attack. Wildlife Officer Patricia Lightning was conducting the technical analysis of the bear's behavior, working with Dr. Mackenzie to understand what had triggered the unprecedented level of aggression. The necropsy of Bear 23M revealed several disturbing findings that would have significant implications for Arctic safety protocols. First, the bear was indeed severely malnourished despite his enormous size. His stomach contained no seal remains or other traditional food sources, only vegetation and what appeared to be garbage fragments, possibly scavenged from human settlements. Second, his teeth showed unusual wear patterns, consistent with gnawing on non-food objects, another sign of desperation and hunger. Most concerning of all, tissue samples revealed elevated levels of stress hormones that indicated the bear had been in a state of chronic starvation, stress for weeks or possibly months. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a polar bear physiologist at the University of Manitoba who analyzed the samples, concluded that Bear 23M had been slowly dying of malnutrition and had likely viewed the humans at the ceremony not as a threat to avoid, but as a potential food source worth the risk of confrontation. This is what we're seeing more and more often as climate change affects sea ice conditions, Dr. Walsh explained during a press conference 3 days after the attack. Bears that would normally be hunting seals on stable ice are being forced inland where they have no natural food sources. Some individuals become increasingly desperate and willing to take risks they would never have taken under normal circumstances. The implications were chilling for Arctic communities throughout Canada. If climate change was creating more bears like 23M, desperate, malnourished predators willing to actively hunt humans, then traditional safety protocols might no longer be adequate. In Yellowknife, Mary Kangook was slowly recovering physically from her hypothermia, but the psychological healing would take much longer. By her 3rd day in the hospital, her core temperature had stabilized and her cardiac function had returned to normal, but she remained haunted by flashbacks to the attack. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Pastor Wright pushing her toward shore and turning to face the charging bear. Dr. Patricia Morin had flown up from Edmonton to provide in-person trauma counseling, recognizing that telephone sessions were insufficient for the severity of Mary's condition. During their first face-to-face session, Mary finally broke down and gave a complete account of what she had experienced in the water. "He pushed me away," she sobbed. "The pastor pushed me away from the bear and told me to swim to shore. I could hear him behind me shouting at the bear, trying to make it come after him instead of me. He saved my life, but I couldn't save his." Dr. Morin recognized the survivor's guilt that was already beginning to consume Mary. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of treating trauma survivors, helping them understand that survival didn't make them responsible for others' deaths, that the choices made in life and death situations often have consequences that no one can control. "Mary," Dr. Morin said gently, "Pastor Wright made a choice to protect you. That choice reflected his character and his faith, not any failure on your part. You didn't cause the bear to attack, and you didn't cause the pastor's death. You survived because someone who cared about you made a heroic sacrifice, and now you have to find a way to honor that sacrifice by healing and moving forward with your life." But healing would be complicated by the media attention that was growing more intense each day. By the 4th day after the attack, news crews from major networks in Canada, the United States, and Europe were arriving in Yellowknife, hoping to interview Mary and the other survivors. The story had captured international attention, partly because of its shocking nature, but also because it represented broader concerns about climate change and human-wildlife conflict. Hospital administrators were forced to post security guards outside Mary's room to prevent unauthorized access by reporters and photographers. The attention was well-intentioned, but ultimately harmful to someone trying to recover from severe psychological trauma. The constant reminder that her personal tragedy had become a global news story was impeding her ability to process what had happened and begin the healing process. Elder Joseph Palliser was facing his own challenges with media attention. As one of the few surviving eyewitnesses to the actual attack, reporters were eager to hear his account of what had happened. But Joseph was struggling with his own mortality. The heart attack had reminded him that at 79 his time was limited, and he was grappling with the meaning of having survived when a younger, stronger man like Pastor Wright had died. "Why did I live when he died?" Joseph asked Dr. Mitchell during one of his cardiac rehabilitation sessions. He was doing God's work. He was trying to save someone. What have I done that was worth more than that? It was a question without easy answers, the kind of existential crisis that often followed traumatic events. Joseph was experiencing what psychologists call survival guilt, the irrational but powerful feeling that surviving when others died was somehow wrong or undeserved. His recovery from the heart attack was being complicated by his emotional state, and Dr. Mitchell was working closely with psychiatry staff to address both his physical and psychological needs. Back in Kugluktuk, the community was struggling to return to normal routines while dealing with the massive disruption caused by media attention and the ongoing investigation. The small hamlet's infrastructure was overwhelmed by the influx of reporters, camera crews, and officials who had descended on the community in the wake of the attack. The Kugluktuk Inn, normally quiet except during summer tourist season, was booked solid for the first time in years. Reporters were paying premium rates for accommodations and meals, bringing an unexpected economic boost to a community that struggled with high unemployment and limited economic opportunities. But the money came with a cost, the constant presence of outsiders, asking painful questions about a tragedy the community was still trying to process. Margaret Ikeyuak, who owned and operated the inn with her husband Paul, found herself in the uncomfortable position of hosting people who were essentially profiting from her community's grief. She understood that the story was newsworthy, but she also saw how the constant media attention was affecting her neighbors and friends. "They keep asking the same questions," Margaret told her husband after another long day of dealing with reporters. "They want to know about polar bear attacks, about safety protocols, about climate change. But what they really want is drama. They want scary stories they can sell to people in the South who will never have to worry about polar bears." The community's relationship with outside media was complicated by cultural factors that most reporters didn't understand or consider. Inuit culture traditionally dealt with tragedy and loss through collective grieving and cultural practices that emphasized community support and spiritual healing. The aggressive, individualistic approach of modern journalism, with its focus on personal interviews and dramatic details, was fundamentally incompatible with how the community wanted to process what had happened. Harold Okina was doing his best to manage the media attention while protecting his community's privacy and dignity. He had designated himself as the primary spokesperson, hoping to control the narrative and prevent reporters from harassing individual community members. But the strategy was only partially successful. Determined journalists were still approaching people on the street, offering money for interviews and photographs. The most intrusive attention was focused on the families of those who had witnessed the attack. David and Sarah Tutu were particularly targeted because their 3 children had been present during the ceremony. Reporters seemed especially interested in interviewing the children, apparently believing that their youth would make them more emotionally expressive and therefore better television. David Tutu was furious about the media's approach to his family. His children were already traumatized by what they had witnessed, and the constant presence of reporters and cameras was making their recovery more difficult. 16-year-old Michael had stopped leaving the house except to go to school, and 8-year-old Bobby was having nightmares every night. "These people don't understand what they're doing to us," David told Harold Okina during an emergency community meeting called to address the media situation. "They think this is just a story, but it's our lives. It's our children's lives. Pastor Wright was our friend, and they're treating his death like entertainment." The community meeting, held on June 3rd, 4 days after the attack, drew nearly 200 people, an unprecedented turnout that reflected both the gravity of the situation and the need for collective response to the crisis. The meeting was held in the community center rather than the church, partly because St. Michael's Arctic mission was too small, but also because the church had become too painful a reminder of what they had lost. Elder Annie Kanguk, Mary's older sister, stood to address the crowd. At 68, Annie commanded enormous respect in the community as a traditional knowledge keeper and cultural leader. Her words carried weight that no elected official or outside expert could match. "Our sister Mary is alive because Pastor Wright gave his life for her," Annie said, her voice strong despite her obvious grief. "This is not a story for other people to make money from. This is our family tragedy, and we need to deal with it our way, in our time, according to our traditions." Annie's speech marked a turning point in the community's response to the media attention. Rather than continuing to accommodate outside reporters, the community leadership decided to establish strict boundaries around who could access the hamlet and under what circumstances. They couldn't legally exclude journalists entirely, but they could control access to community facilities and make it clear that intrusive behavior would not be tolerated. The investigation into the attack was yielding more disturbing information about the changing nature of polar bear behavior in the region. Dr. Robert Mackenzie had analyzed GPS data from 12 other collared bears in the area and found that 4 others were exhibiting similar patterns of inland movement and human territory exploration. "We're looking at a potential paradigm shift in polar bear behavior," Dr. Mackenzie reported to the territorial government's Wildlife Management Committee. "Climate change is forcing bears to adapt their behavior in ways we've never seen before, and some of these adaptations are bringing them into direct conflict with human populations." The implications were staggering for Arctic communities throughout Canada's north. If multiple bears were beginning to view human settlements as potential hunting grounds rather than areas to avoid, then traditional safety protocols based on decades of experience might be dangerously outdated. Wildlife management officials were particularly concerned about the sophistication of Bear 23M's stalking behavior. The GPS data showed that he had spent over an hour positioning himself for the attack, waiting for optimal conditions rather than charging immediately upon detecting humans. This level of tactical planning was more characteristic of wolves or big cats than bears, and it suggested cognitive adaptation that could make future attacks much more difficult to prevent. Dr. Christine Pilfold, a polar bear researcher with Polar Bears International, was brought in to analyze the behavioral data and develop new safety recommendations for Arctic communities. Her preliminary findings were deeply unsettling for anyone living or working in polar bear territory. What we're seeing with Bear 23M appears to be learned behavior. He had successfully used stealth and patience in previous encounters with humans, and he was applying those tactics more aggressively, Dr. Pilfold explained during a briefing with territorial officials. If this behavior is being learned and potentially shared among bears through observation or other mechanisms, we could be looking at a fundamental change in how these animals interact with human populations. The scientific implications were fascinating from a research perspective, but terrifying from a human safety standpoint. Traditional polar bear safety protocols assumed bears would either avoid humans or charge aggressively if surprised or threatened. The possibility that bears were learning to hunt humans systematically would require completely new approaches to coexistence in the Arctic. Meanwhile, the legal implications of the attack were beginning to emerge. While no criminal charges would be filed, the attack was clearly an act of nature rather than human negligence. There were complex questions about liability and compensation that would take months to resolve. Pastor Wright's death raised immediate concerns about workers' compensation and life insurance coverage. As a minister serving a remote community, his employment status was complicated by the fact that he worked for a small religious organization with limited resources and unclear insurance policies. His widow, Rebecca Wright, who lived in Winnipeg, was faced with the prospect of legal battles to secure basic financial support during her grief. Rebecca Wright, 41 years old, had married Samuel 15 years earlier when he was a newly ordained minister serving urban parishes in southern Manitoba. She had supported his call to Arctic ministry even though it meant long separations and constant worry about his safety. Now her worst fears had been realized, and she was dealing with both devastating grief and practical concerns about her financial future. Samuel always said he would rather die serving God than live a safe but meaningless life, Rebecca told her lawyer, Patricia Brennan, during their first meeting to discuss the legal complexities of her husband's death. But I don't think either of us really believed it would come to this. We thought the dangers would be things like plane crashes or equipment failures, not being killed by a polar bear during a baptism. The church organization that had sponsored Pastor Wright's ministry was a small evangelical denomination with limited resources and no previous experience dealing with workplace deaths in hazardous environments. The organization's insurance policies were designed for traditional church settings, not Arctic mission work, and there were significant questions about coverage that would require extensive legal review. More complex were the questions surrounding community liability and government responsibility for public safety. Several legal experts were already speculating about potential lawsuits against various levels of government for failing to provide adequate wildlife management and public safety services in remote communities. Jonathan Hughes, a personal injury lawyer based in Toronto who specialized in dangerous animal attacks, announced his intention to investigate potential legal action on behalf of the survivors. Hughes had handled several high-profile cases involving wildlife attacks in provincial parks and was intrigued by the unique circumstances of the Arctic baptism case. The question is whether reasonable safety precautions were taken given the known risks of polar bear activity in the area, Hughes explained during a telephone interview with CBC News. If government wildlife officials knew or should have known that bears were exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans, there may be liability for failing to warn the public or take preventive action. The suggestion of legal action was deeply unpopular in Kugluktuk, where residents viewed the attack as a tragic accident rather than the result of government negligence. The community had made its own decisions about the risks of the outdoor baptism ceremony, with full knowledge of the potential for polar bear encounters. The idea that outside lawyers would profit from their tragedy was almost as offensive as the media attention they were already enduring. Tommy Krillick, who had served as the primary lookout during the ceremony, was particularly troubled by suggestions that safety protocols had been inadequate. At 74, he had more experience with polar bear encounters than perhaps anyone else in the region, and he knew they had taken reasonable precautions given the circumstances. "We had armed guards. We had medical personnel. We had evacuation plans," Tommy told Harold Okina during a conversation about the potential legal issues. Sometimes things happen in the Arctic that you can't prevent, no matter how careful you are. That bear was different. He was smarter and more determined than any bear I've ever encountered. I don't think any safety protocol could have prevented what happened, but lawyers and insurance investigators were less concerned with Tommy's experiential knowledge than with documented safety procedures and official protocols. In the litigious environment of modern Canada, even tragedies in remote Arctic communities could become the subject of complex legal proceedings that dragged on for years. The territorial government was already conducting its own review of polar bear management policies and public safety protocols. Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Patricia Tutu, no relation to the Tutu family in Kugluktuk, had announced a comprehensive investigation into whether current wildlife management practices were adequate to address the changing behavior patterns being observed in polar bear populations. The death of Pastor Wright is a tragedy that has implications far beyond one community, Minister Tutu stated during a press conference in Iqaluit. If climate change is fundamentally altering polar bear behavior in ways that increase the risk to human populations, we need to understand those changes and adapt our policies accordingly. The safety of northern communities must be our highest priority. The territorial review would examine everything from bear monitoring and early warning systems to community education programs and emergency response protocols. But the process would take months to complete, and in the meantime, communities throughout the Arctic would continue to face the same risks that had proven fatal in Kugluktuk. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had provided medical support during the baptism ceremony, was struggling with her own psychological aftermath from the attack. As a physician, she was trained to save lives, but there had been nothing she could do for Pastor Wright once the bear's attack reached its horrific climax. The feeling of professional helplessness was combining with personal grief to create a complex trauma response. "I keep thinking about the medical supplies I brought," Dr. Chen confided to Dr. Patricia Morin during a counseling session conducted via video link. "I had everything needed to treat hypothermia, cold injuries, even minor trauma. But there's no medical intervention for what that bear did to Pastor Wright. I felt so helpless watching it happen." Dr. Chen's experience highlighted another dimension of the tragedy, the way it had affected not just the direct witnesses, but also the professionals who had tried to help. Police officers, medical personnel, wildlife officials, and even reporters who covered the story were experiencing secondary trauma from exposure to such extreme violence and human suffering. Constable Jennifer Morrison was facing her own crisis of confidence about her role in the events. She had fired multiple shots at the attacking bear, but her service pistol had proven inadequate against such a massive and determined predator. The knowledge that she had been present, armed and trained for exactly this type of situation, but had been unable to prevent Pastor Wright's death, was eating away at her sense of professional competence. "I've trained for active shooter situations, domestic violence calls, high-risk arrests," Constable Morrison told her supervisor, Staff Sergeant William McLeod, during a mandatory debriefing session. "But nothing in my training prepared me for trying to stop a charging polar bear with a pistol. The bullets just didn't have enough stopping power, and by the time I switched to the shotgun, it was too late." Staff Sergeant McLeod, who had 30 years of experience in northern policing, recognized the signs of post-incident trauma in his subordinate. Constable Morrison was an excellent officer who had handled numerous dangerous situations with skill and courage, but the unique circumstances of the bear attack had pushed her beyond the limits of conventional police training. "Jennifer, you did everything right under impossible circumstances," McLeod assured her. "Nobody expects a police officer to be able to stop a 1,400-pound polar bear with a handgun. The fact that you engaged the bear and probably prevented additional casualties shows real courage. Don't let guilt over Pastor Wright's death undermine your confidence as an officer. But overcoming trauma-related guilt was easier said than done, particularly when the incident had been so public and the consequences so devastating. Constable Morrison would require extended counseling and possibly reassignment to help her process what had happened and rebuild her confidence in her ability to protect and serve her community. The story of what happened on May 30th, 2025 at Coronation Gulf would be told and retold throughout the Arctic, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk just beyond the safe boundaries of human civilization. It would remind future generations that no matter how well prepared, how well-intentioned, or how faithful they might be, they were still visitors in a land that belonged to creatures far more powerful and far more dangerous than themselves. The next stories. The Kodiak Shadow. The morning mist hung like a shroud over the Alaskan wilderness as Private First Class Marcus Thompson shouldered his pack and checked his compass one final time. Fort Greely's training grounds stretched endlessly before him, a maze of dense spruce forests, treacherous ravines, and hidden streams that had claimed more than one soldier's confidence over the years. The date was April 27th, and what should have been a routine navigation exercise was about to become something far more sinister. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez stood at the edge of the drop zone, her weathered face scanning the faces of the 12 soldiers under her command. At 34, she had seen enough training exercises go wrong to know that the wilderness respected no rank, no training, and certainly no overconfidence. The soldiers before her ranged from fresh-faced 19-year-olds to seasoned specialists, but Alaska would test them all equally. "Listen up," Vasquez called, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "This is not a game. We're in genuine Kodiak bear territory now. These aren't the black bears some of you might have encountered back home. A full-grown Kodiak can weigh over 1,500 pounds and run faster than any of you can even on your best day. They're smart, they're territorial, and right now we're in the middle of their feeding season." Private First Class Jessica Chen, a 22-year-old communications specialist from Portland, shifted nervously as she adjusted the straps on her radio equipment. She had joined the army to pay for medical school, never imagining she'd find herself in the heart of Alaska's most dangerous wilderness. Her grandmother had always told stories about the spirits that lived in wild places, malevolent entities that fed on human fear and blood. Standing here now, surrounded by countless miles of untamed forest, those childhood stories felt less like folklore and more like warnings. Corporal David Mitchell, a 25-year-old demolitions expert from Texas, tried to project confidence as he checked his gear for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from the cold or nerves he couldn't say. Mitchell had grown up hunting in East Texas forests, but this was different. The Alaskan wilderness felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl, as if thousands of invisible eyes were watching, waiting, measuring them for some purpose he didn't want to contemplate. The training exercise was designed to test their navigation, survival, and communication skills over a 3-day period. Each soldier would be equipped with basic survival gear, emergency rations, and a radio with scheduled check-in times every 6 hours. They would navigate through predetermined waypoints using only map and compass, establishing temporary camps along the way. What made this exercise particularly challenging was that each soldier would be operating alone for the first 24 hours before linking up with designated partners. Specialist Robert Kim, a quiet 23-year-old from Los Angeles, had been looking forward to this exercise. As the son of Korean immigrants, he had always felt the need to prove himself, to show that he belonged in this elite unit. Kim was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to remain calm under pressure. He had excelled in every training scenario so far, but something about this place felt different. The forest seemed to whisper secrets in a language he didn't understand, and the shadows between the trees appeared to move independently of the wind. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures ranging from 38 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect conditions for what Sergeant Vasquez privately considered to be one of the most challenging exercises in their training rotation. The terrain they would be covering included dense forest, several stream crossings, rocky outcroppings that required basic climbing skills, and at least one significant elevation change that would test their endurance and navigation abilities. Private First Class Amanda Rodriguez, a 20-year-old from New Mexico, had been the top performer in her advanced individual training. She was eager to prove herself in this real-world environment, but something in her gut told her to be extra careful today. Rodriguez had an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, a skill that had kept her alive during a difficult childhood in Albuquerque's rougher neighborhoods. That same instinct was screaming at her now, though she couldn't identify why. As the soldiers spread out to their individual starting positions, none of them noticed the massive tracks pressed deep into the soft earth near the tree line. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night, and they belonged to something that had been watching the humans prepare for their journey into its domain. Each print measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the toe pads. Kodiak bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, are found only on the islands of the Kodiak archipelago in Alaska. Adult males can reach weights of up to 1,500 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs. They possess an incredible sense of smell, capable of detecting scents from miles away, and their intelligence rivals that of primates in many respects. What makes them particularly dangerous is their territorial nature and their complete lack of fear when it comes to humans. The bear that had been observing the soldiers was a massive male, estimated to be around 12 years old and weighing approximately 1,200 pounds. Local wildlife biologists had been tracking this particular animal for several years, noting its unusual behavior patterns and its tendency to show interest in human activity. They had designated him Bear 274 in their research files, though the local Alutiiq people had their own name for him, Anyu, which meant to hunt in their traditional language. Anyu had been wandering closer to human settlements and military installations over the past several months, a behavior that concerned both wildlife officials and military personnel. Most bears avoided human contact, but Anyu seemed curious about humans in a way that made experienced outdoorsmen deeply uncomfortable. He had been spotted on several occasions watching hiking groups from a distance, following them for miles without making his presence known. Until now, these encounters had ended without incident, but bear behavior experts knew that curiosity could quickly turn to aggression, especially during feeding season. Private First Class Marcus Thompson was the first to set off into the wilderness, his assigned route taking him through the densest section of forest toward a series of waypoints that would eventually lead him to a predetermined campsite approximately 8 miles from the starting position. Thompson was a natural leader, the kind of soldier who others looked to for guidance during difficult situations. At 24, he had already completed 2 deployments overseas and had earned a reputation for level-headedness under pressure. As Thompson made his way through the undergrowth, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of birds, small animals and insects, but underneath it all was a quality of silence that made him deeply uncomfortable. Every few hundred yards, he would stop and listen, trying to identify what was bothering him about his surroundings. The silence would last for just a few seconds, as if some large presence had passed through the area, causing all the smaller creatures to hold their breath until it moved on. Thompson's first waypoint was located at the top of a rocky ridge that offered an excellent view of the surrounding terrain. As he climbed, the dense forest gave way to more open ground, dotted with large boulders and sparse vegetation. The physical exertion felt good after months of indoor training, and for the first time since beginning the exercise, Thompson felt his confidence returning. He reached the waypoint ahead of schedule and took a few minutes to study his map and plan his route to the next checkpoint. It was while he was sitting on a large boulder consulting his compass that Thompson first saw the tracks. They were pressed deep into a patch of soft earth near a small stream, and they were unlike anything he had ever seen. Thompson had grown up in rural Montana and was familiar with black bear tracks, but these were massive. He knelt down to examine them more closely, noting the size of the claw marks and the depth of the impression in the soil. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered to himself, pulling out his field manual to double-check the identification guidelines for bear sign. According to the manual, these tracks belonged to a Kodiak bear, and based on their size and depth, it was an exceptionally large specimen. More concerning was the fact that the tracks appeared to be following the same general direction as his planned route to the next waypoint. Thompson made his first scheduled radio check-in at 10 a.m., reporting his position and the discovery of bear sign to Sergeant Vasquez at base camp. Vasquez logged the report and reminded Thompson of the standard bear encounter protocols. Make noise while traveling, properly secure all food and scented items, and maintain situational awareness at all times. She also noted the location of Thompson's bear sign report on her tactical map, intending to pass the information along to the other soldiers during their check-ins. What neither Thompson nor Vasquez realized was that Anu had been following Thompson since shortly after he left the starting position. The massive bear moved through the forest with surprising stealth for an animal of his size, staying downwind and maintaining a distance of several hundred yards. Anu's behavior was highly unusual for a Kodiak bear, which typically avoided human contact unless protecting cubs or a food source. This bear seemed genuinely curious about the human, following him with the patience of a predator studying potential prey. Meanwhile, Private First Class Jessica Chen was having her own encounter with the Alaskan wilderness. Her assigned route took her through a series of meadows and along several small streams, terrain that should have been relatively easy to navigate. However, Chen was struggling with her compass readings and had begun to suspect that she was moving in the wrong direction. The GPS unit that was supposed to serve as a backup navigation aid was malfunctioning, displaying error messages every time she tried to get a position fix. Chen's grandmother had always told her that electronic devices failed in places where the spirits were strong, and standing alone in this vast wilderness, those words carried more weight than they ever had before. She had grown up in Portland's Chinatown, surrounded by urban noise and constant human activity. The silence of the Alaskan forest was so complete that it felt almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional call of a raven or the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. At 11:30 a.m., Chen made the decision to backtrack to her last confirmed waypoint and recalculate her route. It was the right decision tactically, but it meant that she would be traveling through the same area twice, potentially creating a scent trail that would be easy for predators to follow. As she retraced her steps, Chen noticed something that made her blood run cold. Massive paw prints in the soft earth near a stream crossing, prints that hadn't been there when she passed through the area less than 2 hours earlier. Chen immediately radioed base camp to report her discovery, but her transmission was garbled by atmospheric interference, a common problem in Alaska's mountainous terrain. Sergeant Vasquez was able to make out only fragments of Chen's report. Large tracks, following me, request, changed route. Vasquez attempted to reach Chen for clarification, but received no response. Unknown to Chen, she had unknowingly wandered into Anyu's established territory, an area the massive bear had been claiming and defending for the past several years. The bear had marked his territory using the traditional methods: claw marks on trees, scent markings, and the occasional pile of scat placed strategically along game trails. These signs were clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for, but Chen's urban background hadn't prepared her to recognize the warnings. Anyu had detected Chen's scent almost immediately after she entered his territory. Unlike his patient stalking of Thompson, the bear's response to Chen was more aggressive. He began closing the distance between them, moving from his usual following distance of several hundred yards to less than 100 yards. The bear's behavior suggested that he viewed Chen as a more significant intrusion into his territory, possibly because her erratic movement pattern and backtracking had confused him or triggered some sort of defensive response. Corporal David Mitchell was making excellent progress on his assigned route when he stumbled upon what appeared to be the remains of a large animal kill. The carcass was several days old and had been partially covered with brush and debris, a behavior typical of bears who cache food for later consumption. Mitchell approached the site carefully, noting the size of the bite marks and claw marks on the remaining bones. This had been a large ungulate, possibly a moose, and whatever had killed it was powerful enough to break bones that Mitchell couldn't even bend. Mitchell photographed the kill site with his field camera and marked the location on his map, intending to report it during his next scheduled radio check-in. What he didn't realize was that bear caches are often actively defended, even when the bear is not immediately present. By approaching the cache and spending time photographing it, Mitchell had left his scent all over an area that Anyu considered to be his private food storage facility. The bear detected Mitchell's presence at the cache site within hours of the intrusion. Anyu's response was immediate and territorial. He abandoned his patient stalking of Thompson and began moving rapidly toward the location where Mitchell had violated his cache. The bear's behavior had shifted from curious to aggressive, and his movements through the forest became less stealthy and more direct. At 2 p.m. during the scheduled radio check-in, Sergeant Vasquez began to piece together a troubling pattern. Thompson had reported bear sign along his route. Chen had made a garbled transmission about large tracks and possibly being followed, and Mitchell was reporting the discovery of what appeared to be a large predator cache. When she plotted these locations on her tactical map, Vasquez realized that all three soldiers were operating within a relatively small geographical area, and their routes would bring them even closer together as they moved toward their designated camping areas. More concerning was the fact that Chen had missed her 2 p.m. radio check-in entirely. Vasquez attempted to raise Chen on the emergency frequency, but received only static in response. Protocol called for soldiers to attempt radio contact every 30 minutes if they missed a scheduled check-in, but Chen's radio had been silent for over an hour. Vasquez made the decision to redirect Specialist Kim, who was operating in an adjacent area, to attempt to make contact with Chen. Kim was the most experienced tracker in the unit and had spent considerable time in wilderness environments before joining the army. If anyone could locate Chen and determine what was preventing her from making radio contact, it would be Kim. Kim received his new orders at 2:30 p.m. and immediately altered his course to intersect with Chen's last reported position. As he moved through the forest, Kim noticed signs that made him increasingly concerned about his fellow soldiers' welfare. There were multiple sets of human footprints in the soft earth along a stream bed, suggesting that Chen had passed through the area several times, possibly indicating that she was lost and attempting to retrace her route. More ominously, Kim discovered several locations where large paw prints intersected with the human tracks. The bear sign was fresh, made within the last several hours, and the spacing between the prints suggested that the animal had been moving at a fast walk or slow trot. Kim had enough experience with bear behavior to recognize that this was not casual movement. The bear was following the human tracks with purpose. Kim radioed his observations to Sergeant Vasquez using coded language to avoid creating panic among the other soldiers who might be monitoring the communications frequency. "Base, this is Specialist Kim. I'm observing game sign consistent with our earlier reports. The sign appears to be following a parallel route to our missing team member. Recommend immediate status check on all personnel." Vasquez understood immediately what Kim was reporting. She began attempting to raise all soldiers on the emergency frequency, demanding immediate position reports and status updates. The responses she received painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the situation developing in the field. Thompson reported that he was still observing bear sign along his route, but noted that the tracks seemed to be getting fresher as he moved toward his evening camping location. Mitchell confirmed that he was making good progress and had observed no additional predator activity since leaving the cache site. However, his transmission was interrupted by what sounded like heavy breathing and the sound of branches breaking, followed by radio silence. When Vasquez attempted to re-establish contact with Mitchell, his radio produced only static. Kim, who was closest to Mitchell's last reported position, was immediately redirected to investigate. The change in mission priorities meant that the search for Chen would have to be delayed, a decision that would have devastating consequences in the hours to come. At 3:45 p.m., Chen found herself in the worst possible situation for a soldier operating alone in bear territory. She had become completely lost. Her compass readings were inconsistent, and her radio was producing only intermittent static when she tried to transmit. More concerning was the growing certainty that she was being followed. Chen had caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision throughout the afternoon, shadows that seemed too large and too deliberate to be caused by wind or small animals. Chen's survival training had covered bear encounters, but the classroom instruction hadn't prepared her for the psychological impact of being stalked by an apex predator in its natural environment. Every sound in the forest made her jump. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a massive, threatening presence. Her heart rate had been elevated for hours, and the constant adrenaline was beginning to affect her decision-making abilities. Following the guidance from her training, Chen had been making noise as she traveled, talking to herself and occasionally clapping her hands to alert any bears to her presence and give them the opportunity to avoid her. However, this strategy was having the opposite effect on Anyu, who interpreted the noise as a sign of distress or weakness. In the bear's experience, healthy animals moved quietly through the forest. Loud, erratic behavior was associated with injured or dying animals, and Anyu had learned that such animals made for easy prey. At 4:15 p.m., Chen made a decision that would seal her fate. Exhausted from hours of hiking and consumed by fear, she decided to establish an impromptu camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. She reasoned that she could rest for a few hours, get her bearings, and attempt to re-establish radio contact with base camp. It was a logical decision under normal circumstances, but Chen had unknowingly chosen to camp directly in the center of one of Anyu's regular travel routes. Chen set up her small tent and arranged her gear according to the bear safety protocols she had learned during training. All food and scented items were stored in a bear canister and hung from a tree branch at least 12 feet off the ground and 4 feet from the trunk. She had followed the procedures exactly, but no amount of training could have prepared her for what was about to happen. Anyu had been observing Chen from a distance of approximately 50 yards, hidden in the dense underbrush at the edge of the clearing. The bear's behavior had reached a critical point where curiosity had transformed into predatory interest. Chen's erratic movements throughout the day, combined with her obvious distress, had triggered something in the bear's behavioral programming that identified her as potential prey rather than a threat to be avoided. At 4:30 p.m., Kim reached Mitchell's last reported position and made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. Mitchell's backpack was lying on the ground, next to a large fallen tree, its contents scattered across a wide area. The pack had been torn open by something with incredible strength, and several items were missing entirely. Most ominously, Mitchell's rifle was lying 20 feet away from the pack, its stock splintered and its barrel bent at an impossible angle. Kim immediately began searching for signs of Mitchell himself, following a trail of disturbed vegetation and torn clothing that led deeper into the forest. The trail was easy to follow because whatever had created it had moved through the underbrush with enough force to break branches and leave deep impressions in the soft earth. Kim had been tracking for less than 10 minutes when he found Mitchell. The young soldier was alive, but barely. He was wedged between two large boulders, unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. His left arm was clearly broken, and there were deep lacerations on his chest and back that appeared to have been made by claws. Mitchell's breathing was shallow and irregular, and Kim could see that the soldier was in shock. Kim immediately radioed base camp to report the situation and request emergency medical evacuation. However, the terrain in their current location made helicopter extraction impossible, and Kim realized that he would have to stabilize Mitchell and somehow get him to a landing zone that was over 2 miles away through dense forest. While Kim was dealing with Mitchell's medical emergency, Chen was about to face her own encounter with Anyu. The massive bear had been circling Chen's campsite for over an hour, staying just outside the tree line and observing her behavior. Chen had noticed movement in the shadows several times, but had convinced herself that it was just her imagination combined with fatigue and stress. At 5:47 p.m., as Chen was attempting to start a small fire using her emergency fire-starting kit, Anyu made his decision. The bear stepped out of the tree line and into the clearing, moving with the confident gait of an apex predator that had decided to claim its territory. Chen looked up from her fire-starting attempts and found herself face-to-face with the largest predator in North America. Time seemed to slow down as Chen processed what she was seeing. The bear was massive beyond her comprehension, standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, even on all fours. Its head was enormous, easily the size of a truck tire, and its small, intelligent eyes were focused entirely on her. The bear's coat was dark brown, almost black in places, and she could see the powerful muscles rippling underneath as it moved. Chen's training told her to avoid direct eye contact, make herself appear large, and back away slowly while speaking in a calm, steady voice. She tried to follow these procedures, but her body wasn't cooperating. Her legs felt like rubber, her mouth was completely dry, and her voice came out as a barely audible whisper. "Easy, big guy," Chen managed to say, raising her arms above her head and taking a small step backward. "I'm not a threat. I'm just passing through." Danyu's response to Chen's submissive behavior was not what her training had prepared her for. Instead of losing interest and moving away, the bear took several steps closer, his head lowered and his ears pinned back against his skull. These were signs of an aggressive bear, not a curious one, and Chen realized with growing horror that this encounter was not going to end with the bear simply walking away. Chen continued backing away from the bear, but her retreat was blocked by the dense trees at the edge of the clearing. Anyu continued his approach, closing the distance between them with deliberate, measured steps. The bear was now less than 20 feet away, close enough that Chen could hear his breathing and see the saliva dripping from his massive jaws. In desperation, Chen reached for the bear spray attached to her belt, fumbling with the safety clip as Anyu continued his advance. The bear spray was her last line of defense, a concentrated capsaicin solution designed to temporarily disable aggressive bears and give humans time to escape. However, bear spray was only effective at close range, typically 10 feet or less, and it had to be deployed accurately in high-stress situations. Chen managed to get the bear spray free from its holster and removed the safety clip. But as she raised the canister to aim it at the approaching bear, Anyu suddenly charged. The bear's charge was explosively fast, covering the remaining distance between them in less than 2 seconds. Chen had just enough time to press the trigger on the bear spray before 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The bear spray had minimal effect on Anyu, partially because Chen's aim was off-target due to panic, and partially because a slight breeze in the clearing caused much of the spray to disperse before reaching the bear. What little spray did make contact with Anyu's face only seemed to enrage him further, and his initial physical contact with Chen was devastating. Chen was thrown backward by the force of the bear's charge, her small frame no match for Anyu's massive bulk. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her lungs and causing her to see stars. Before she could recover, Anyu was on top of her, his massive paws pinning her to the ground while his jaws sought her throat. Chen managed to roll partially onto her side and pull her arms up to protect her neck and face, a defensive maneuver that probably saved her life in those first crucial seconds. Anyu's initial bite caught her forearm instead of her throat, his massive teeth puncturing muscle and grinding against bone. The pain was indescribable, but Chen forced herself to remain as still as possible, remembering her training about playing dead during a bear attack. However, Anyu's behavior was not typical of a defensive bear attack. Instead of delivering a few punishing bites and then withdrawing, the bear continued his assault, biting and clawing at Chen's prone form with the persistence of a predator consuming prey. Chen's attempts to play dead were unsuccessful because Anyu wasn't attacking her out of fear or territoriality. He was attacking her as food. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 3 minutes. Chen drifted in and out of consciousness as Anyu bit and clawed at her, her body going into shock from blood loss and trauma. At some point during the attack, Chen managed to trigger the emergency beacon on her GPS unit, sending a distress signal that would eventually guide rescuers to her location. Anyu's assault on Chen was interrupted by a sound that caused him to lift his massive head and listen intently. In the distance, he could hear the approach of a helicopter, its rotors beating a rhythmic pattern that was foreign to the bear's wilderness experience. The sound triggered some deep-seated wariness in Anyu's behavioral programming, and he made the decision to abandon Chen and retreat into the forest. The helicopter was a medical evacuation aircraft dispatched to extract Mitchell, who Kim had managed to stabilize and move to a landing zone 2 miles from where he had been found. The helicopter crew had no idea that there was a second emergency in progress less than a mile from their landing zone. But the sound of their approach had inadvertently saved Chen's life by causing Anyu to break off his attack. Chen lay motionless in the clearing for nearly 20 minutes after Anyu's departure, drifting between consciousness and shock-induced unconsciousness. Her injuries were severe, deep lacerations on her arms, chest and back, a partially severed ear, and what felt like several broken ribs. Most seriously, she was losing blood from multiple wounds, and without immediate medical attention, she would not survive the night. At 6:23 p.m., Kim received Chen's emergency beacon signal on his GPS unit while he was waiting with Mitchell at the helicopter landing zone. The signal indicated that Chen was approximately 0.8 miles from their current position, but Kim was faced with an impossible choice: Accompany Mitchell on the medical evacuation flight to ensure his fellow soldier received proper care, or attempt to locate and assist Chen while the helicopter departed with Mitchell. Kim made the decision to send Mitchell on alone while he attempted to locate Chen. It was a decision that went against standard protocol, which called for wounded soldiers to be accompanied by a buddy during medical evacuation. But Kim couldn't abandon Chen if she was injured and calling for help. He quickly briefed the helicopter crew on the situation and requested that they return for a second extraction as soon as they had delivered Mitchell to the hospital. The helicopter departed with Mitchell at 6:35 p.m., leaving Kim alone in the wilderness with rapidly fading daylight and the knowledge that somewhere nearby, Chen was in serious trouble. Kim immediately began moving toward Chen's beacon signal, following a bearing that took him through some of the densest forest in the training area. Meanwhile, Sergeant Vasquez was dealing with a crisis situation at base camp. She had lost contact with 3 soldiers. One was confirmed injured and en route to the hospital, and there were multiple reports of aggressive bear activity throughout the training area. Standard protocol called for the immediate extraction of all remaining personnel, but with only 1 helicopter available and 3 soldiers still unaccounted for in the field, extraction was going to be a complex operation. Vasquez made the decision to activate the emergency response protocols, which involved notifying Fort Greely's command structure, requesting additional helicopter assets, and alerting the Alaska Wildlife Troopers about the bear activity. She also began preparing the remaining soldiers at base camp for potential participation in search and rescue operations. Thompson, who was still operating alone in his assigned sector, received orders to halt his movement and establish a defensive position while rescue operations were organized. Thompson had been making good progress toward his evening campsite, but the discovery of increasingly fresh bear sign along his route had left him deeply concerned about his safety. When he received the order to halt and await further instructions, Thompson was actually relieved. Thompson found a defensible position on a rocky outcropping that offered good visibility in all directions and settled in to wait for rescue. However, his elevated position also made him visible to Anu, who had been tracking Thompson throughout the afternoon and was now observing him from a distance of approximately 200 yards. Kim reached Chen's location at 7:15 p.m., just as the last of the daylight was fading from the sky. What he found in the small clearing made his stomach turn, and his hands shake with a combination of rage and fear. Chen was lying motionless near the cold remains of her attempted campfire, her clothing torn and bloody, her small form looking incredibly fragile in the growing darkness. Kim approached Chen carefully, calling her name and listening for any response. Chen was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently and shivering from a combination of shock and exposure. Kim immediately began first aid procedures, applying pressure bandages to the worst of Chen's wounds and wrapping her in his emergency sleeping bag to combat hypothermia. Chen's injuries were severe, but Kim's assessment indicated that they were not immediately life-threatening if he could get her proper medical care within the next few hours. The most serious wounds were deep lacerations on her left arm and shoulder, but the bleeding had slowed significantly since the attack. Kim believed that Chen's chances of survival were good if he could get her evacuated quickly. However, Kim's radio calls to base camp were producing only static, likely due to atmospheric interference and the surrounding terrain. He activated his own emergency beacon and settled in to wait for rescue, not knowing that his signal was being received, but that helicopter operations had been suspended due to darkness and weather conditions that were moving in from the west. At 8:30 p.m., Thompson's defensive position on the rocky outcropping was compromised when Anu decided to investigate this new human who had remained stationary for several hours. The bear's approach to Thompson was different from his earlier encounters with the other soldiers. Anu moved deliberately and openly, making no attempt to conceal his presence as he climbed toward Thompson's position. Thompson first noticed the bear when Anu was approximately 100 yards away, a massive shadow moving through the scrub vegetation below his rocky perch. Thompson's initial reaction was relief that he had followed his training and established a position with good visibility and multiple escape routes. However, as he watched the bear's approach, Thompson realized that this was not a chance encounter. The bear was deliberately moving toward his position. Thompson immediately radioed base camp to report the approaching bear, but like Kim, he received only static in response. The approaching weather front was creating significant atmospheric interference, and communications throughout the training area had become increasingly unreliable as the evening progressed. Following his training, Thompson began making noise to alert the bear to his presence and hopefully convince it to change direction. He shouted, clapped his hands, and banged his metal canteen against the rocks around his position. The bear's response to these noises was not what Thompson expected. Instead of retreating, Anu actually increased his pace and began moving directly toward the base of Thompson's rocky outcropping. Thompson's defensive position, which had seemed ideal when he was concerned about ground-level threats, became a trap when faced with a climbing predator. Kodiak bears are excellent climbers, capable of ascending steep rocky terrain with surprising speed and agility. Anu began climbing toward Thompson's position with the confidence of an animal that had successfully navigated similar terrain thousands of times. Thompson realized that his position was compromised and began looking for escape routes. The rocky outcropping was approximately 30 feet high, with steep sides that offered few handholds for human climbers. Behind Thompson's position, the terrain dropped off into a ravine that was too deep and steep to descend safely in darkness. His only viable escape route was a narrow ledge that led around the side of the outcropping, but using it would require him to move within striking distance of the approaching bear. As Anu continued his climb, Thompson made the decision to abandon his position and attempt to reach the ledge. He gathered his essential gear and began moving laterally across the rock face, using hand and footholds that seemed secure in daylight, but felt treacherous in the growing darkness. Behind him, he could hear the sound of Anu's claws scraping against rock as the massive bear continued his ascent. Thompson had covered approximately 20 feet along the ledge when his left foot slipped on loose gravel, causing him to lose his balance and slide several feet down the rock face before catching himself on a small outcropping. The fall had torn his uniform and scraped skin from his hands and knees, but more importantly, it had brought him within range of Anu's reach. The bear had reached Thompson's original position and was now looking down at the soldier clinging to the rock face below him. Anu's behavior at this point was curious, rather than immediately aggressive. He seemed to be studying Thompson with the same intelligence that had characterized his stalking behavior throughout the day. The bear made several vocalizations, low rumbling sounds that Thompson could feel in his chest even from his precarious position on the cliff face. Thompson remained as still as possible, hoping that the bear would lose interest and move on. However, Anu's next action made it clear that the encounter was far from over. The massive bear began descending toward Thompson's position, moving with the sure-footed confidence of an animal perfectly adapted to this terrain. Thompson had no choice but to continue his traverse along the ledge, moving as quickly as he dared while trying to maintain 3 points of contact with the rock face. Behind him, Anu continued his descent, the bear's massive claws finding purchase on rock surfaces that seemed too smooth to support such weight. The sounds of the bear's movement were terrifyingly close, and Thompson could smell Anu's distinctive musky odor on the evening breeze. The ledge that Thompson was traversing gradually widened as it wrapped around the outcropping, eventually opening onto a slope that could be descended safely to ground level. Thompson reached this escape route with Anu less than 10 feet behind him, close enough that he could hear the bear's heavy breathing and the scraping of claws on stone. Thompson made the decision to abandon caution and slide down the slope as quickly as possible, sacrificing stealth and safety for speed. He half slid, half fell down the rocky slope, using his hands and feet to control his descent, while loose stones and debris cascaded around him. The controlled fall brought Thompson to ground level in less than 30 seconds, but also left him disoriented and separated from much of his gear. Anu's response to Thompson's rapid descent was to abandon his careful climbing approach and simply leap from his position on the ledge to the slope below. The bear's landing was surprisingly graceful for an animal of his size, and within seconds he was pursuing Thompson across the uneven terrain at the base of the outcropping. Thompson ran through the darkness with Anu in pursuit, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over obstacles he couldn't see in the fading light. The chase continued for several hundred yards before Thompson stumbled and fell, rolling down a small embankment and coming to rest in a tangle of fallen branches and debris. Thompson lay still in the debris, listening for sounds of the bear's approach and trying to control his breathing. For several minutes, the forest was silent, except for the normal sounds of insects and small animals. Thompson began to hope that he had escaped, that the bear had lost interest or lost his trail in the darkness. However, Thompson's hope was short-lived. Within 10 minutes of his fall, he could hear Anu moving through the forest nearby, the bear's heavy footsteps crushing vegetation and breaking branches as he searched for Thompson's trail. The bear was hunting now, using his incredible sense of smell to track Thompson through terrain where visual tracking was impossible. Thompson remained hidden in the debris for over an hour, listening to Anu's methodical search of the area. Several times the bear passed within yards of Thompson's hiding place, close enough that Thompson could see his massive silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. Each time, Thompson held his breath and remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement or sound would give away his position. At 10:45 p.m., Thompson's ordeal took a turn for the worse when the weather front that had been approaching throughout the evening finally arrived. What began as a light rain quickly intensified into a steady downpour, soaking through Thompson's torn uniform and making his hiding place increasingly uncomfortable. The rain also had the effect of washing away scent trails, which should have made it more difficult for Anu to track him. However, the rain also created new problems for Thompson. The debris pile where he was hiding began to accumulate water, and the cold rain, combined with his torn clothing, created a dangerous hypothermia risk. Thompson realized that he couldn't remain in his current position indefinitely. He would have to move eventually, and when he did, he would be vulnerable to discovery by the bear that was still searching the area. Meanwhile, back at base camp, Sergeant Vasquez was coordinating a complex rescue operation in increasingly difficult conditions. The weather front had grounded helicopter operations indefinitely, and radio communications with the soldiers in the field had become completely unreliable. She had lost contact with Thompson, Kim, and Chen, and had only sporadic communication with the remaining soldiers who were still operating in other sectors of the training area. Vasquez made the decision to organize a ground-based search and rescue operation using the soldiers who were still at base camp, supplemented by search and rescue personnel from Fort Greely and the Alaska State Troopers. However, organizing and deploying ground teams in darkness and bad weather would take several hours, meaning that the soldiers in the field would have to survive the night on their own. The Alaska Wildlife Troopers had been monitoring the situation and were particularly concerned about the reports of aggressive bear behavior. Trooper Sarah Martinez, a wildlife specialist with over 15 years of experience in bear management, was en route to Fort Greely to assist with the situation. Martinez had dealt with problem bears throughout Alaska and recognized the behavior patterns being described as highly unusual and dangerous. According to Martinez's experience, bears that showed the kind of persistent interest in humans that was being reported typically had to be destroyed before they seriously injured or killed someone. The behavior described in the reports from the training exercise suggested a bear that had lost its natural fear of humans and was beginning to view them as prey rather than a threat to be avoided. Martinez arrived at Fort Greely at 11:30 p.m. and immediately began coordinating with military personnel to develop a response plan. The plan called for ground teams to locate and extract the missing soldiers, while wildlife officers attempted to locate and assess the problem bear. If the bear was deemed to be an immediate threat to human life, Martinez was authorized to destroy the animal using whatever means necessary. However, implementing this plan in darkness and bad weather would be extremely dangerous for both the rescue teams and the soldiers they were trying to save. Martinez recommended waiting until dawn to begin ground operations, but military commanders were reluctant to leave their personnel in the field for another 6 hours with an aggressive bear in the area. The compromise solution was to deploy limited ground teams with night vision equipment and powerful spotlights, focusing on the last known positions of the missing soldiers. These teams would establish forward operating positions and attempt to re-establish radio contact, but would not conduct full search operations until daylight. Thompson's situation became critical shortly after midnight when hypothermia began to affect his decision-making abilities. The cold rain had soaked through his clothing completely, and his core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Thompson began experiencing the confusion and poor judgment that characterized the early stages of hypothermia, and he made the decision to leave his hiding place and attempt to find better shelter. Thompson's movement immediately attracted Anyu's attention. The bear had remained in the area throughout the night, apparently convinced that his prey was nearby, but unable to pinpoint Thompson's exact location. When Thompson began moving through the forest, Anyu was able to track him both by sound and by scent, despite the rain. The final confrontation between Thompson and Anyu occurred in a small clearing approximately half a mile from the rocky outcropping where the encounter had begun. Thompson, weakened by exposure and disoriented by hypothermia, stumbled into the clearing and collapsed near a fallen tree. He was no longer capable of coherent thought or coordinated movement, and when Anyu emerged from the tree line, Thompson was unable to mount any effective defense. Anyu's attack on Thompson was swift and decisive. Unlike his prolonged assault on Chen, the bear's encounter with Thompson lasted less than 60 seconds. Thompson's hypothermic condition had left him unable to resist or fight back, and Anyu's massive jaws found their target on the first attempt. Thompson's emergency beacon activated automatically when his GPS unit detected that he had been motionless for more than 10 minutes, sending a distress signal that would guide rescuers to his location. However, the signal came too late to save Thompson's life. When rescue teams reached his position at dawn, they found only torn equipment and blood evidence that told the story of what had happened in the clearing. Kim and Chen spent the night huddled together in Chen's small clearing, taking turns staying awake to watch for the bear's return. Chen's condition had stabilized somewhat, but she was still weak from blood loss and in need of professional medical attention. Kim had managed to establish a defensive perimeter around their position using noisemakers and scent deterrents, but he knew that these measures would be ineffective if Anyu decided to return. The rescue helicopter reached Kim and Chen at 7:30 a.m., guided by their emergency beacon signals. Chen was immediately evacuated to the regional trauma center, where she would undergo surgery to repair the damage from Anyu's attack. Her recovery would take months and would include extensive physical therapy and psychological counseling to help her deal with the trauma of the bear attack. Kim was also evacuated, suffering from exposure and exhaustion but otherwise uninjured. His quick thinking and first aid skills had undoubtedly saved Chen's life, and he would later receive a commendation for his actions during the crisis. Mitchell, who had been evacuated the previous evening, was in stable condition at the hospital with multiple fractures and lacerations. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and doctors expected him to make a full recovery within 6 months. The search for Thompson continued throughout the morning, with ground teams and helicopter crews scouring the area around his last known position. The discovery of his remains in the small clearing came as a shock to the rescue teams, even though they had been prepared for the worst after losing radio contact with him for over 12 hours. Trooper Martinez located Anyu approximately 2 miles from the scene of Thompson's death, using tracking techniques and knowledge of bear behavior patterns to predict where the animal would go after the encounter. The massive bear showed no fear when confronted by the wildlife officers, confirming Martinez's assessment that this was an animal that had lost its natural wariness of humans and had become genuinely dangerous. The decision to destroy Anyu was not made lightly, but Martinez and her team concluded that the bear's behavior made it an unacceptable risk to human life. The bear was killed with a single rifle shot from a high-powered hunting rifle, ending a life that had lasted approximately 12 years and had included increasingly dangerous interactions with humans over the past several months. The necropsy performed on Anyu revealed some interesting details about the bear's condition and behavior. The animal was in excellent physical health, weighing 1,247 pounds and showing no signs of disease or injury that might have explained his aggressive behavior toward humans. However, stomach contents analysis revealed that Anyu had been consuming an unusual amount of human-related food sources, including garbage and food scraps that had been improperly disposed of by campers and military personnel. This finding supported the theory that Anyu's aggressive behavior had been learned rather than instinctual. Bears that become accustomed to human food sources often lose their natural fear of humans and may begin to associate people with easy meals. In Anyu's case, this conditioning had apparently progressed to the point where he viewed humans not just as sources of food, but as food themselves. The investigation into the training exercise revealed several factors that had contributed to the tragic outcome. Inadequate communication equipment had prevented the soldiers from maintaining contact with base camp during critical moments of the crisis. Weather conditions had interfered with radio transmissions and grounded helicopter operations when rescue efforts were most needed. Most importantly, intelligence about bear activity in the training area had been incomplete, failing to identify Anyu as a potentially dangerous animal. The military's response to the incident included immediate changes to training protocols, upgraded communication equipment, and enhanced coordination with wildlife authorities to monitor animal activity in training areas. The incident also led to increased emphasis on wilderness survival training and bear encounter procedures for soldiers operating in Alaska. Chen's recovery was long and difficult, involving multiple surgeries to repair nerve damage in her left arm and extensive psychological therapy to help her cope with post-traumatic stress disorder. She eventually returned to limited duty, but requested transfer to a position that would not require field operations in wilderness environments. Chen's experience became part of the curriculum for survival training courses, helping to educate future soldiers about the realities of wildlife encounters. Mitchell made a full physical recovery from his injuries and returned to active duty within 8 months of the incident. However, he also struggled with psychological effects of the trauma and eventually sought counseling to help him process what he had experienced. Mitchell became an advocate for improved safety protocols in wilderness training exercises and worked with military instructors to develop better procedures for dealing with wildlife encounters. Kim was recognized for his heroic actions during the crisis and was awarded the Soldier's Medal for his life-saving efforts. He used his experience to develop new training programs that emphasized wilderness first aid and emergency response procedures. Kim remained on active duty and continued to serve as an instructor for wilderness survival courses. Thompson's death was classified as a line-of-duty fatality, and he was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. His family established a memorial fund that provides scholarships for young people interested in careers in wildlife management and conservation. Thompson's story became part of the military's educational materials about wildlife safety, helping to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The incident had broader implications for military training operations in Alaska and other wilderness areas. New protocols were established requiring real-time wildlife monitoring during training exercises, improved communication systems that could function reliably in remote areas, and enhanced coordination between military and civilian wildlife authorities. The psychological impact of the incident extended beyond the soldiers who were directly involved. Other members of their unit struggled with survivors' guilt and fear about future wilderness training exercises. The military response included counseling services for all unit members and modifications to training procedures that reduced the psychological stress associated with solo operations in dangerous environments. Sergeant Vasquez, who had been responsible for coordinating the training exercise, underwent extensive review of her decisions and actions during the crisis. While investigators concluded that she had followed established protocols and had made reasonable decisions based on the information available to her, Vasquez struggled with feelings of responsibility for Thompson's death. She eventually sought counseling and was reassigned to a position that did not involve field training operations. The incident also had significant implications for bear management policies in Alaska. Wildlife authorities implemented new procedures for monitoring bear behavior near military installations and established protocols for sharing information about potentially dangerous animals with military personnel. The case of Anu became a textbook example of how human food sources can condition bears to become dangerous to people. Public reaction to the incident was mixed, with some people criticizing the military for conducting training exercises in known bear habitat, while others praised the courage and professionalism of the soldiers involved. The story received significant media attention, leading to increased awareness about the risks of human-wildlife conflicts and the importance of proper food storage and waste management in bear country. Environmental groups used the incident to highlight the need for better coexistence strategies between humans and wildlife, while military supporters emphasized the necessity of realistic training exercises to prepare soldiers for combat operations in diverse environments. The debate led to improved dialogue between military, environmental, and wildlife management communities about balancing training needs with wildlife conservation. The families of the soldiers involved in the incident became advocates for improved safety measures in military training operations. They worked with congressional representatives to secure funding for better communication equipment and emergency response capabilities for wilderness training exercises. Their efforts led to legislation that required regular safety reviews of all military training operations conducted in areas with significant wildlife populations. Scientific researchers used the incident as a case study in bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict. The detailed documentation of Anu's behavior patterns provided valuable insights into how bears can become habituated to humans and transition from avoidance behavior to predatory behavior. This research contributed to improved guidelines for bear management and public safety education. The incident also highlighted the importance of mental health support for soldiers involved in traumatic events. The military's response included expanded counseling services, peer support programs, and improved procedures for identifying and treating post-traumatic stress disorder. These improvements benefited not only the soldiers involved in the Bear incident, but also military personnel dealing with trauma from combat operations and other dangerous assignments. Training facilities in Alaska and other wilderness areas implemented new safety measures based on lessons learned from the incident. These included improved perimeter monitoring, upgraded communication systems, enhanced coordination with local wildlife authorities, and revised procedures for conducting solo training exercises. The changes represented a significant investment in soldier safety and demonstrated the military's commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The story of the training exercise became part of the institutional memory of Fort Greely and other military installations in Alaska. New soldiers arriving for wilderness training learned about Thompson, Chen, Mitchell, and Kim as part of their safety orientation. The incident served as a powerful reminder that military training, while necessary for combat readiness, carries real risks that must be carefully managed and continuously evaluated. Years after the incident, the survivors continued to deal with its psychological effects in different ways. Chen became involved in wildlife conservation efforts, working to promote better understanding between humans and bears. Mitchell pursued a career in emergency medicine, inspired by his experience with trauma and recovery. Kim remained in the military and became a respected instructor in survival techniques and crisis management. The memory of Private First Class Marcus Thompson lived on in the memorial established by his family and in the safety protocols that bore his name. Thompson's rules became standard procedure for wilderness training exercises, emphasizing communication, buddy system protocols, and wildlife awareness. His sacrifice contributed to improved safety for thousands of soldiers who would follow in his footsteps, ensuring that his death was not in vain. The incident at Fort Greely became a turning point in how military and civilian authorities approached the challenge of human-wildlife coexistence in Alaska. The collaborative response to the tragedy led to improved communication, better safety procedures, and a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between humans and the wild animals that share their environment. The story served as a reminder that in the wilderness, humans are not the apex predator, and that respect for wildlife is not just an environmental concern, but a matter of life and death. The next stories. The Glacier National Park incident. The morning of July 9, 2024, dawned crisp and clear over the western entrance to Glacier National Park, Montana. At 6:47 a.m., the temperature registered 38 degrees Fahrenheit at the Apgar Visitor Center, with visibility extending 15 miles across Lake McDonald toward the Continental Divide. Weather Service forecasts called for partly cloudy skies, with afternoon temperatures reaching the mid-70s, perfect conditions for what should have been a routine family camping trip. Amanda Christine Davis, 34, had been planning this expedition for 8 months. A senior project manager for Cascade Environmental Solutions in Seattle, Amanda possessed extensive backcountry experience, including wilderness first aid certification and over 200 logged trail miles across Washington's Olympic Peninsula. Her meticulous nature extended to trip planning. She had researched every mile of their intended route along the North Fork Flathead River, studied recent wildlife activity reports, and packed according to a detailed checklist refined over 15 years of outdoor adventures. Amanda drove a metallic blue 2019 Toyota 4Runner equipped with all-terrain tires, emergency communication equipment, and a reinforced roof rack carrying their camping gear. The vehicle's odometer read 47,832 miles as they passed through the park entrance at 7:15 a.m. Her husband, Michael Robert Davis, 36, sat in the passenger seat reviewing topographical maps of their planned campsites. A software engineer for Microsoft's Azure division, Michael brought his analytical approach to outdoor activities, cross-referencing GPS coordinates with elevation profiles and water source locations. In the rear seats sat Amanda's sister, Jennifer Louise Martinez, 28, a pediatric nurse from Portland's Oregon Health and Science University, and Jennifer's fiancé, David Patrick Chen, 31, a geological survey specialist with the United States Forest Service. David's professional familiarity with northwestern Montana's ecosystem made him their de facto wildlife expert. The couple had flown from Portland to Kalispell the previous day, their hiking boots still bearing traces of volcanic ash from their recent Mount Hood expedition. Accompanying them was Marcus William Thompson, 42, Amanda's longtime friend and former wilderness guide, who now operated Thompson Adventure Consulting in Whitefish, Montana. Marcus served as their unofficial trip leader, his weathered hands and permanently squinted eyes testament to over 20 years guiding hunters, photographers and adventure seekers through Montana's backcountry. His knowledge of local wildlife patterns, particularly grizzly bear behavior in the North Fork drainage, was encyclopedic. The sixth member of their party was Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Hoffman, 38, a wildlife biologist with the University of Montana's Flathead Lake Biological Station. Sarah specialized in ursine behavioral ecology and had spent the previous 4 summers radio-collaring grizzlies throughout the northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Her presence on the trip was both professional and personal. She was documenting human-wildlife interaction patterns while enjoying a rare vacation with her longtime friend, Amanda. Their destination was a series of backcountry campsites along the North Fork Flathead River, specifically sites N7 through N12 in the park's northwest quadrant. The area, known locally as the Bowman Creek Drainage, offered pristine fishing opportunities and spectacular views of the Livingston Range. More importantly for Sarah's research, it represented prime grizzly habitat during the late summer berry season. At 8:33 a.m., they stopped at the Polebridge Mercantile, a rustic general store serving as the last resupply point before entering true wilderness. The establishment's proprietor, 71-year-old Eugene "Gene" Klassen, had operated the store for 37 years and possessed intimate knowledge of local wildlife patterns. Gene emerged from behind the counter, his flannel shirt and suspenders giving him the appearance of a man displaced from the previous century. "Heading up toward Bowman?" Gene asked, recognizing the telltale signs of serious backpackers. "Seen quite a bit of grizzly sign up that way recently. Big Boar been working the huckleberry patches above the river?" Marcus stepped forward, introducing himself and explaining their planned route. Gene nodded thoughtfully, his pale blue eyes assessing the group's preparedness. "You folks look like you know what you're doing, but that particular bear's been acting peculiar. Found some of his scat yesterday morning, full of rubber and plastic fragments. Probably got into somebody's improperly stored food." Sarah's professional interest was immediately piqued. "Could you describe the scat more specifically? Size, consistency, contents?" "Bigger around than a coffee can, maybe 14 inches long. Still soft, so fresh. Besides the usual berry matter, I seen what looked like tent fabric and some kind of metal, maybe from a can or cooking pot." Gene paused, studying Sarah's reaction. "You some kind of scientist?" "Wildlife biologist, University of Montana. We're documenting human-wildlife interactions in the park." Sarah pulled out a waterproof notebook, recording Gene's observations. This bear you mentioned? Any visual confirmation? Size estimates? Saw him 3 days back, maybe quarter-mile from the old Bowman Lake Trail junction. Massive animal, probably 8.5 feet standing, maybe 700 pounds or better. Light-colored face, dark body, with a distinctive white patch on his chest shaped like a crescent moon. Been calling him Crescent on account of that marking. The name sent a chill through David Chen, whose Forest Service experience included reviewing incident reports from across the region. Crescent, that name's familiar. Wasn't there a property damage incident involving a bear by that description? Gene's expression grew somber. 2 weeks back, he completely destroyed a cabin up near Quartz Lake, tore the roof clean off, scattered contents over half an acre. Fish and Wildlife relocated him once already this season, but he keeps coming back. That's unusual behavior, even for a problem bear. Amanda felt the first flutter of unease, though her logical mind recognized that thousands of visitors safely traversed grizzly country every year. What's your recommendation? Should we consider alternate campsites? Not necessarily. Just be extra careful with food storage, make noise on the trail, and keep your bear spray accessible. Gene walked them to a detailed topographical map mounted on the store's wall. If I was you, I'd avoid the upper Bowman drainage entirely. Stick to the lower river sites closer to the road. That big boar seems to prefer the high country, but bears travel. Marcus studied the map, his trained eye identifying potential hazard areas. We appreciate the heads up, Gene. We'll adjust our route accordingly. They purchased additional bear canisters, backup spray and emergency signaling devices before departing at 9:47 a.m. The gravel road leading to their trailhead stretched 12 miles through dense lodgepole pine forest with occasional clearings offering glimpses of the surrounding peaks. Wildlife was abundant. They spotted a cow moose with twin calves, a family of mountain goats on distant cliffs, and numerous deer feeding in roadside meadows. The conversation during this drive focused on wildlife safety protocols and emergency procedures. Sarah provided detailed information about grizzly behavior, explaining that bears entering hyperphagia, the intensive feeding period before hibernation, are more likely to attack humans. Hibernation could consume up to 30,000 calories daily and might exhibit increased aggression around food sources. The key thing to remember, Sarah explained, is that we're entering their habitat. Every precaution we take is about coexistence, not conquest. A bear's first instinct is usually to avoid humans, but if they've become food conditioned, that dynamic changes. At 10:52 a.m., they reached the North Fork Flathead River trailhead, elevation 3,847 feet. The parking area contained only 2 other vehicles, a white Ford pickup with Wyoming plates and a red Jeep Cherokee from California. Marcus noted their license numbers in his trip log, a standard precaution for backcountry travelers. The group spent 43 minutes organizing gear and conducting final equipment checks. Each person carried a primary pack weighing between 38 and 52 pounds, containing shelter, food, clothing, and safety equipment. Amanda's pack included a satellite communicator capable of sending distress signals and text messages to emergency services, technology that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. Their planned route followed the North Fork Flathead River Trail for 4.7 miles, before branching onto a secondary trail leading to their first campsite. The terrain was relatively gentle, gaining only 623 feet in elevation over the initial segment. Trail conditions appeared excellent, with well-maintained tread and clear blazing. The hiking began at 11:35 a.m. under partly cloudy skies. Marcus led the group, followed by Sarah, then David and Jennifer, with Michael and Amanda bringing up the rear. This formation allowed Marcus to identify potential hazards while keeping their wildlife expert in a position to observe and document animal sign. The first mile passed through mature Douglas fir forest with an understory of huckleberry, serviceberry, and mountain ash, prime bear forage. Sarah noted numerous scratch marks on trees, some reaching heights that indicated very large bears. The claw marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from damaged bark. "These scratches tell a story," Sarah explained during a brief rest stop. "Male grizzlies mark territory this way, but they also communicate information about their size and dominance. The height of these marks suggests we're definitely in big bear country." David photographed several marking trees, recording GPS coordinates for each location. His geological training made him naturally observant of environmental details, and he noticed something troubling. Many of the berry bushes showed signs of aggressive feeding, with entire branches stripped and damaged rather than the selective feeding typically associated with bears. "This feeding pattern looks almost frantic," he observed, like the bear was in a hurry or extremely hungry. At 1:18 p.m., approximately 2.3 miles from the trailhead, they encountered their first direct evidence of recent bear activity. Fresh scat lay directly in the center of the trail, still steaming in the cool mountain air. Marcus immediately called for a group halt, recognizing the significance of finding such fresh sign. Sarah approached carefully, pulling on latex gloves before examining the scat. Her professional analysis confirmed Jean's earlier observations. The droppings contained partially digested huckleberries, pine nuts, and several disturbing non-organic materials, including fabric fragments, plastic pieces, and what appeared to be aluminum foil. "This is definitely from a food-conditioned bear," she announced. "The presence of human materials indicates previous access to improperly stored camping supplies. More concerning is the size. This animal is significantly larger than average." Marcus made the decision to increase their noise production, requiring each person to call out, "Hey bear," every 30 seconds while hiking. He also redistributed the group's bear spray, ensuring everyone had immediate access to deterrent devices. The trail continued through increasingly dense forest, with visibility limited to 30 or 40 yards in most directions. Stream crossings became more frequent as they approached the river drainage, and the sound of running water masked their approach noise. These conditions, limited visibility, natural sound barriers, and prime habitat, represented textbook bear encounter scenarios. At 2:45 p.m., they reached a major trail junction marked by a weathered wooden sign indicating distances to various backcountry destinations. Marcus consulted his map and GPS unit, confirming their location as coordinates 48 degrees, 49 minutes, 32 seconds north, 114 degrees, 18 minutes, 17 seconds west. They were now 3.8 miles from the trailhead and approximately 2 miles from their intended campsite. During this navigation stop, Jennifer noticed movement in the peripheral forest approximately 80 yards upslope from their position. Initially dismissing it as wind-blown vegetation, she eventually realized the movement was too purposeful, too coordinated to be natural. "Guys," she whispered urgently, "there's something large moving through the trees above us." Marcus immediately signaled for absolute silence, his hand moving instinctively to his bear spray. The group froze, straining to identify the source of Jennifer's concern. For nearly 3 minutes, they heard nothing but wind and distant water. Then came a sound that sent ice through their veins, the distinctive huffing and jaw-popping that indicates an agitated or stressed grizzly bear. Sarah's professional knowledge kicked in immediately. "Everyone stay calm," she whispered. "That's likely a defensive posture, not aggressive. The bear probably just became aware of our presence." The huffing continued for several more seconds, then ceased entirely. Marcus waited a full 5 minutes before signaling the group to continue, but their pace had changed dramatically. Where before they had hiked with the relaxed confidence of experienced outdoors enthusiasts, they now moved with the hypervigilant awareness of prey animals in predator territory. The final 1.9 miles to their campsite took nearly 2 hours to complete, with frequent stops to listen for wildlife and assess their surroundings. The trail descended gradually toward the North Fork Flathead River, and they could hear the rushing water long before seeing it through the forest canopy. Their designated campsite, North Fork Site N9, sat on a small bench approximately 40 feet above the river at elevation 3,912 feet. The location offered excellent views up and down the drainage while providing access to fresh water and level ground for tents. More importantly, from a safety perspective, the open nature of the site provided good visibility in all directions. The group arrived at 4:52 p.m. and immediately began establishing camp according to strict bear country protocols. Food storage occurred in designated bear canisters placed at least 100 yards from sleeping areas and 12 feet above ground when possible. Cooking and eating areas were established downwind from tents, with all food-scented items properly secured after each meal. Marcus and David erected a large tarp between two mature pines, creating a communal gathering space for meals and evening activities. Amanda and Michael set up their two-person tent on the bench's eastern edge, while Jennifer and David chose a spot near the riverbank. Sarah positioned her single tent slightly apart from the others, allowing her to monitor wildlife activity during the night. By 6:15 p.m., camp was fully established and dinner preparation had begun. The meal consisted of freeze-dried beef stroganoff, supplemented with fresh vegetables and bread purchased at Polebridge. Conversation during dinner focused on the day's observations and plans for the following day's activities, which included fishing, photography, and continued hiking deeper into the wilderness. As darkness approached, however, the mood began to shift. Small incidents occurred that, individually, seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested they were not alone in the valley. Equipment left on the tarp's periphery was found moved or knocked over. Strange sounds emanated from the forest, not the typical nighttime chorus of owls and small mammals, but something larger moving through the underbrush. At 9:33 p.m., as the group prepared for sleep, Marcus made a disturbing discovery. While conducting a final perimeter check with his headlamp, he found fresh tracks in soft soil near their water source. The prints were unmistakably grisly, massive paws measuring nearly 11 inches long and 7 inches wide, with clearly defined claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the toe pads. "Everyone needs to see this," Marcus called quietly, not wanting to create panic, but recognizing the gravity of their situation. The group gathered around the tracks, which were so fresh that water was still seeping into the deepest impressions. Sarah knelt beside the prints, her professional eye taking detailed measurements. "This bear is enormous," she announced. "Based on these track dimensions, I'd estimate at least 700 pounds, possibly more. And look at the stride length. This animal wasn't just passing through. It was investigating our campsite. The realization that a massive grizzly had approached their camp, possibly while they were eating dinner, sent shockwaves through the group." Marcus immediately implemented enhanced security protocols, establishing a watch system that would ensure someone remained awake throughout the night. He also moved all bear spray to positions immediately accessible from each tent. "I want everyone to sleep fully clothed tonight," Marcus instructed. "Keep your boots on, keep your headlamp within reach, and if anyone hears anything unusual, wake the entire camp immediately. No exceptions." The first watch fell to Marcus and Sarah, both of whom possessed extensive experience with nighttime wildlife encounters. They positioned themselves under the tarp, with a clear view of the forest approaches, armed with powerful flashlights and bear spray. The night was unusually quiet. Even the typical sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed muted, as if other animals were also aware of a large predator's presence. At 11:47 p.m., during Marcus's solo watch, he heard the first definitive evidence of the bear's continued presence. The sound came from approximately 50 yards upslope from camp, the unmistakable crack of a large branch breaking under substantial weight. Marcus immediately awakened Sarah, and together they conducted a careful scan of the forest perimeter with their lights. The beam of Marcus's flashlight eventually caught a pair of eyes reflecting amber light approximately 60 yards from camp. The eyes were positioned at least 4 feet above ground level, confirming the presence of a very large bear standing on its hind legs. For nearly 30 seconds, human and bear regarded each other across the darkness before the eyes disappeared back into the forest. "That was definitely Crescent," Sarah whispered. "The size matches Gene's description perfectly. He's investigating us, trying to determine if we represent a threat or an opportunity." Marcus made the difficult decision not to immediately wake the others, reasoning that panic in the middle of the night could lead to dangerous mistakes. Instead, he and Sarah maintained heightened vigilance, documenting each sound and movement throughout the remaining darkness. The bear's presence continued to manifest throughout the night. At 1:23 a.m., the sound of sniffing and huffing could be heard from the direction of their food storage area. Marcus and Sarah observed a large shadow moving between trees, but maintained their position rather than confronting the animal directly. At 2:51 a.m., something large brushed against the guy lines of Amanda and Michael's tent, causing both to wake instantly. "Marcus!" Amanda's whispered voice carried clearly in the still air. "Is everything okay?" "We're monitoring a bear in the area," Marcus replied quietly. "Stay in your tent, but be prepared to move if I give the word." The remainder of the night passed in tense alertness, with each person lying awake in their sleeping bags, straining to interpret every sound. Dawn, when it finally came at 5:47 a.m., brought both relief and renewed concern. The bear had not approached during the final hours before sunrise, but fresh evidence of its nocturnal investigation was immediately apparent. Tracks circled their entire campsite, some passing within 15 feet of the tents. Several large trees bore fresh scratch marks at heights that confirmed the animal's enormous size. Most disturbing was evidence that the bear had attempted to access their food storage area, leaving deep claw gouges in the bark of trees supporting their bear canisters. "This behavior is extremely unusual," Sarah observed, while documenting the overnight activity. "Most bears avoid human camps, but this individual is actively investigating us. That suggests either extreme hunger or previous positive associations with human food." The group convened an emergency planning session over breakfast, weighing their options for the remaining days of their trip. Marcus advocated for immediate evacuation, arguing that the bear's persistent presence represented an unacceptable risk. Amanda and Michael supported this position, recognizing that their safety was more important than completing their planned itinerary. David and Jennifer initially argued for relocating to a different campsite rather than abandoning their trip entirely. "We've invested months of planning and taken vacation time specifically for this adventure," Jennifer pointed out. "Maybe we could move to a more populated area of the park." Sarah's professional opinion proved decisive. "This bear is exhibiting pre-attack investigative behavior. The nocturnal approach, the scent investigation, the territorial marking around our camp, these are all indicators that he's moving beyond simple curiosity toward potential aggression. We need to leave." The decision to evacuate was finalized at 7:35 a.m., but breaking camp and preparing for departure would require nearly 2 hours. During this process, the bear's presence became increasingly obvious. Trees surrounding their campsite showed fresh scratch marks that hadn't been present the previous evening. The sound of breaking branches and huffing could be heard at regular intervals from the surrounding forest. At 8:42 a.m., while Amanda was stuffing her sleeping bag into its compression sack, she became aware of being watched. The sensation was unmistakable, that primitive alertness that evolution had bred into humans for survival in dangerous environments. Slowly raising her head, she found herself looking directly at an enormous grizzly bear standing approximately 40 yards away at the forest edge. The bear was exactly as Jean had described, massive beyond belief, with a light-colored face contrasting against a dark brown body and a distinctive crescent-shaped white patch clearly visible on his chest. He stood motionless, studying the humans with obvious intelligence. His ears were forward, indicating alertness rather than aggression, but his sheer size was overwhelming. "Everyone freeze," Amanda whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "The bear is here." Marcus immediately began implementing bear encounter protocols, speaking in a calm, firm voice while slowly reaching for his bear spray. "Easy, bear. We're leaving. Just let us go." For nearly 5 minutes, the standoff continued. The bear showed no signs of retreat, but also displayed no immediate aggressive intentions. He seemed to be assessing the situation, possibly determining whether these humans posed a threat to his territory or might provide access to food. Sarah observed the bear's body language with professional interest, even while adrenaline flooded her system. "His posture indicates curiosity rather than aggression," she whispered, "but stay ready. That can change instantly." The resolution came suddenly and unexpectedly. A distant sound, possibly another hiker on the trail or wildlife moving through the forest, caught the bear's attention. His head turned toward the source, ears swiveling to pinpoint the location. After a moment's consideration, he dropped to all 4 legs and disappeared into the forest with surprising speed for such a massive animal. The group remained frozen for several additional minutes, scarcely believing their close encounter had ended without violence. When they finally resumed packing, their movements were hurried and efficient. Every few seconds, someone would scan the forest edge for signs of the bear's return. Breaking camp took another 47 minutes, with constant vigilance maintained throughout the process. The group formation for hiking out differed significantly from their approach. Marcus led with bear spray ready, followed closely by the others in a tight formation that minimized their vulnerability to surprise encounters. The 4.7-mile hike to their vehicle became a study in controlled urgency. They moved quickly, but not frantically, making considerable noise to avoid surprising the bear or other wildlife. Rest stops were brief and conducted only in areas with excellent visibility in all directions. At 11:26 a.m., they reached the trailhead parking area to find their Toyota 4Runner exactly as they had left it. The relief of reaching safety was palpable, but Sarah reminded everyone that bears occasionally investigated vehicle areas as well. They loaded their gear quickly and efficiently, each person eager to put distance between themselves and the wilderness that had so recently felt threatening. As Amanda started the engine and began their drive toward the park entrance, the group processed their experience through discussion and nervous laughter. What had begun as a routine camping trip had become a vivid reminder of their place in the natural world, not as masters of the environment, but as visitors in a realm where other creatures held dominion. That was incredible, Jennifer reflected as they drove through the forest. Terrifying, but incredible. How many people get to see a wild grizzly that close and walk away? Marcus nodded, already beginning to view the experience through the lens of a professional guide. That bear gave us every opportunity to leave peacefully. In many ways, the encounter demonstrated perfect bear behavior, investigation without aggression, territorial awareness without attack. Sarah was already planning her research report based on the observations she had documented. The behavioral patterns we observed will contribute valuable data to our understanding of human-bear interactions. This individual showed remarkable restraint, considering his size and obvious dominance in that environment. At 12:43 p.m., they stopped again at the Polebridge Mercantile to report their encounter to Jean and anyone else who might benefit from current information about Crescent's location and behavior. Jean listened intently to their account, nodding knowingly at several points. "That bear's been escalating his behavior for weeks now," Jean confirmed. "You folks did exactly the right thing by clearing out when you did. Crescent's not aggressive by nature, but he's getting bolder around humans. That's never a good sign." Jean immediately contacted Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to report the encounter, providing detailed information about the bear's location and recent activity. "They'll probably want to move him again, though it hasn't been particularly effective so far." The drive back to Kalispell took 93 minutes, during which the group continued processing their experience. What had begun as a wilderness adventure had evolved into something deeper, a profound encounter with one of North America's most magnificent and dangerous predators. By 2:15 p.m., they were safely back in civilization, their camping gear spread across the parking lot of Michael and Amanda's hotel for cleaning and inventory. Every piece of equipment was accounted for, and remarkably, nothing had been damaged during their encounter with Crescent. That evening, over dinner at a local restaurant, they reflected on the experience that would undoubtedly become a defining memory for each of them. The encounter had lasted less than 24 hours from first evidence to final departure, but its impact would resonate far longer. "I've been guiding people in bear country for 20 years, Marcus observed, "and I've never seen anything quite like that. The intelligence in that animal's eyes, the way he assessed us, it was like looking at another apex predator who recognized us as equals rather than prey." Sarah's scientific perspective provided additional context. "Bears like Crescent represent the successful recovery of grizzly populations in the northern Rockies. 50 years ago, he might not have existed. His presence, even his boldness around humans, indicates a healthy ecosystem." Amanda raised her glass in a toast, to Crescent and to the reminder that we share this world with creatures far more powerful than ourselves, and to the fact that we're all sitting here safe and sound to tell this story. The July 9th, 2024, encounter with the grizzly bear known as Crescent became legendary among Montana's outdoor community. Sarah's detailed behavioral documentation contributed to several research papers on human-bear interactions. Marcus incorporated the experience into his guide training programs, using it as an example of proper wilderness response protocols. 6 weeks later, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks successfully relocated Crescent to a more remote section of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where he continued his natural behavioral patterns away from human contact. Camera traps occasionally captured images of the magnificent bear, his distinctive crescent marking clearly visible as he pursued his ancient routines in the Montana wilderness. The incident served as a powerful reminder that wilderness areas remain truly wild, inhabited by creatures whose power and intelligence demand respect rather than fear. For Amanda, Michael, Jennifer, David, Marcus and Sarah, their encounter with Crescent represented not a frightening ordeal, but a profound privilege, the opportunity to glimpse one of nature's most magnificent predators in his own domain, and return with nothing more than memories and a deeper appreciation for the natural world.